Close your eyes, and let us travel to Babylon, capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, in the 21st year of Nebuchadnezzar II. It is the year 584 BCE. You stand upon the western bank of the Euphrates, where the river bends through the heart of Babylon, greatest city of its age. Behind you rise walls of baked brick said to be so broad that chariots could pass upon their summits, and beyond them, the blue-glazed towers of the Ishtar gate catch the last light of a Mesopotamian afternoon. Yet let us step backward to an earlier hour, when the sky above Babylon is beginning to pale from charcoal to dove grey, and the morning mist still clings to the water. You are standing on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River in the spring of 600 BCE. The water moves past your feet in a broad, brown sweep, carrying downstream the night-cooled sediment of 1,000 northern miles. Around you, the reeds stand in dense silver thickets, and their damp fragrance mixes with the faint brine of fish scales drying on woven mats nearby. Fishermen in loincloths wade to their thighs in the shallows, casting circular nets with a motion so practiced it seems part of the current itself, and the weighted edges strike the surface with soft, rhythmic slaps that echo against the far bank. The city waits across from you, still half dissolved in river mist, though already you can discern the mass of its walls rising like a geological formation against the brightening east. Nebuchadnezzar II has ruled here for about 5 years, since around 65 BCE, when his victory over Egyptian forces at Carchemish helped secure his throne and important trade routes that now sustain this city. You know this because the merchants mutter it in their cups, because the scribes record it in their year formulas, because the very scale of what rises before you speaks of a king who commands labor beyond counting. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which began in 626 BCE and endured until the Etemenanki conquest of 539 BCE, found in this monarch one of its most ambitious architects. Your feet find the towpath where mud sucks softly at each step, compressed and recompressed by the passage of donkeys hauling grain barges from the northern estates. The clay is cool through your sandals, still holding the night's moisture, and you can trace in its surface the overlapping crescents of recent hooves. A barge glides past, its hull low with harvested barley, and the poleman calls out to someone unseen in the mist with a voice rough as river gravel. The cool morning air rises from the Euphrates, carrying the smell of water reeds and fish across your face, and you notice how it parts around the massive bulk of the walls ahead, diverted upward in faint, visible currents of temperature and scent. Babylon lies in what is now central Iraq. You know only that you have traveled south through flat, irrigated country where palm groves give way to open cultivation, where the canals branch and branch again like the veins in a leaf, until they finally surrender their waters to this great arterial river. The city covered approximately 850 hectares at its maximum extent, and even now, approaching from the riverward side, you feel the compression of human intention that such numbers imply, the gathering of fields and workshops and tenements and temples into a space bounded and defended and made deliberate. The quay widens ahead, and you walk among the morning's commerce with the unhurried pace of one who belongs here or nearly belongs. Porters shoulder sacks of emmer wheat toward the weighing stations, their bare feet slapping on the damp planks. A woman in a fringed shawl sorts dried fish into baskets, her fingers quick and stained with brine. The Euphrates River divided Babylon into eastern and western halves, and you would have stood on the eastern bank, traditionally considered the older quarter, where early settlements may have clustered before kings raised great walls. The water reeds rustle behind you, and somewhere a heron lifts from its fishing with a cry like a wooden hinge. Now the walls command your full attention, and you slow your pace without deciding to slow, drawn into the scale of their construction. The inner walls run roughly 8 kilometers in circumference, and you are approaching one stretch of that immense perimeter where the brickwork rises in stepped masses, each course set back slightly from the one below, creating a slope that men and horses might ascend, though enemies could never force it. The walls were constructed of mud brick with baked brick facing, and where the morning light strikes them, you see the color shift from wet umber to fired rose, the kiln's transformation written across every visible surface. Bitumen was used as mortar between courses of brick, and in certain angles of light, it gleams darkly between the joints. The petroleum seep of this region turned to adhesive and sealant by ancient Mesopotamian builders. Babylon's walls were sometimes included in older lists of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and if they stood today, one might imagine how such wonder propagated, how travelers could have carried reports of these structures to distant courts where lesser kings might measure their own ambitions against this standard. The outer wall system, including moats, created multiple defensive layers, and you can see now the first ditch, water-filled and planted with spikes, then the intermediate glacis, then the main rampart itself rising in its double succession of height. The heat is already building in the dust as the sun clears the eastern wall, and the bitumen begins to soften slightly, releasing its ancient, tarry scent into the warming air. You follow the towpath where it curves to meet a lesser gate, not the great processional way that kings take, but a working entrance for merchants and their goods. The mud squelches underfoot where donkeys have passed, and you step around a fresh pile of dung still steaming in the cool morning. The gate tower looms, its arched passage dark against the brightening day, and from within comes the murmur of negotiation, the eternal commerce of entry and exit. Guards in leather corselets examine a cart loaded with copper ingots, their spears resting against the wall as they gesture and demand. They speak Aramaic and Akkadian in alternating phrases, the imperial tongue of administration mingling with the mercantile language of the Western tribes, and you understand enough to follow the dispute. The merchant claims his toll was paid upstream. The guard insists on verification from a tablet he does not possess. The Neo-Babylonian kings were often called Chaldeans by Greek authors, and in the Old Testament, though they did not use this term themselves. And this guard with his sharp cheekbones and his ritual tattoo of Marduk's dragon might resent the label if he knew of it, might not recognize himself in foreign descriptions written centuries hence. The actual origin of the Neo-Babylonian rulers has not been clarified, not fully, not to the satisfaction of scholars who sift southern archives for genealogies that may never have been committed to clay. But here, in this moment, such uncertainty matters less than the weight of the spear in this man's hand, the authority vested in his examination of seals and signatures. You pass through while their argument continues, neither challenged nor welcomed, simply absorbed into the flow of morning traffic. The tunnel of the gate smells of stale urine and the smoke of watchfires, and your eyes adjust slowly to the dimness. Then you emerge, and Babylon opens before you like a manuscript whose first page has been turned. The distant clatter of bronze wheels on brick pavement high above draws your gaze to the chariot road atop the inner rampart, where military traffic moves in continuous patrol. You see the flash of harness, the raised dust of rapid passage, and hear the rhythmic percussion of rim against road surface, a sound that will continue through all the hours of daylight, that marks the boundary between the controlled interior and the watched exterior. Below this elevated highway, the city unfolds in its complexity, and you stand for a moment simply receiving it, letting your eyes travel from foreground to horizon without fixing on any single element. The skyline of Babylon reveals itself in layers. Nearest, the dense fabric of residential quarters, flat roofs and narrow streets, and the occasional courtyard tree rising above its wall. Beyond these, the greater mass of temples, the ziggurats terraced in receding squares toward the sky, each level painted in sacred colors that the morning sun begins to activate, blue and white and gold emerging from the general dun as the light strengthens. Palace roofs appear in gilt and glazed tile, the private elevations of power that common eyes may glimpse but never approach. And threading upward everywhere, the smoke from 10,000 cooking fires, thin columns dispersing into the warming air, carrying the smell of flatbread and sesame oil and the dung fuel that feeds domestic hearths across this vast settlement. The city likely contained numerous temples, palaces, and residential quarters connected by streets and canals, and we can imagine this not merely as historical abstraction, but as lived geometry. The paths one might walk from any point to another, the waterways that would run alongside foot traffic, and the sacred precincts that may have interrupted the secular grid with their own orientations, perhaps aligned to stars and to the river's flow. You move forward into a street that leads roughly west, toward the river's other bank, toward the administrative heart where Nebuchadnezzar II has raised his father's achievements to unprecedented elaboration. The cool morning air rising from the river still reaches you here, attenuated but present, a thread connecting your current position to the bank where you began. The street is narrow, its brick pavement worn concave by generations of sandaled feet, and the buildings press close on either side, their lower courses blackened with the soot of countless mornings. A door opens, and a servant emerges with a basin of night soil, carrying it toward the central drain that will eventually feed the agricultural canals beyond the walls. You step aside, and she passes without acknowledgement, absorbed in her task, her face marked with the tired patience of early labor. The mud underfoot here is drier, baked by yesterday's heat and only superficially dampened by the night's cool, and your footsteps produce a soft percussion against the brick, answered by the distant clatter of bronze wheels on brick pavement high above, where the rampart road continues its surveillance. A dog sleeps in a doorway, twitching in some dream of chase, and you pass it without disturbing the flies that cluster at the corner of its closed eyes. The street widens gradually, admitting more light, and you enter a small plaza where a canal crosses your path, its water green with algae, its surface broken by the occasional silver of fish rising for insects. A bridge of baked brick spans it, the arch low enough that you must duck slightly, and on its far side the character of the neighborhood changes, becoming more spacious, more evidently planned. Here the houses stand farther apart, their walls whitewashed, their doors framed in blue-glazed brick that catches the strengthening sun. Gardens become visible, date palms and pomegranate trees, and the ordered rows of vegetable plots that supply the kitchens of the wealthy. You are walking now toward the greatest of the temple complexes, though you may not yet know its name, may not yet distinguish Esagilla from Etemenanki in your understanding. The ziggurat rises ahead, its stages becoming clearer as you approach, the baked brick facing of its core exposed where the decorative skin has fallen or been stripped. Workers climb its flanks even now, carrying baskets of fresh bitumen to repair some winter damage, their figures small against the mass, their movements slow and deliberate as the architecture itself. A priest passes you in the street, his shaved head gleaming with oil, his linen robes spotless despite the dust that rises from every footfall. He carries a staff topped with the symbol of Marduk, the patron deity whose temple you approach, and his eyes rest on you briefly, assessing, finding nothing that requires intervention, moving on. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which existed from 626 to 539 BCE, invested significant spiritual importance in this city, making it more than an administrative center, cosmic pivot, the place where heaven and earth maintain their proper relation through correct ritual and sufficient magnificence. The plaza before the temple opens suddenly, a space of relative emptiness after the compression of streets, and you pause at its edge. The ziggurat dominates, but around its base cluster lesser shrines, storehouses, the workshops of artisans who supply the gods' requirements, the barracks of temple guards. People move through this space with the purposeful hurry of those who belong to institutions, who serve functions rather than merely inhabiting spaces. A scribe sits cross-legged on a low platform, his tablet on his knees, taking dictation from a steward who gestures toward an arriving shipment of cedar wood. The aromatic scent reaches you, expensive, foreign, the product of distant mountains carried down the river and across the plains to this flat country where no such trees grow. You find a shaded step and sit, not from fatigue, but from the desire to let the scene settle around you, to become part of its duration rather than merely passing through. The cool morning air rising from the river has warmed now, losing its distinctive fragrance, becoming simply air, simply the medium of breath and presence. The mud that's squelched underfoot on the towpath where donkeys have passed has dried on your sandals to a dull film, and you scrape it absently against the brick step, watching it crumble to powder, watching it join the general dust of this place. From your seated position, the distant clatter of bronze wheels on brick pavement high above comes and goes, patrols circling, messengers rushing. The ordinary traffic of empire conducted at an elevation that separates it from the ground-level negotiations of market and temple. You imagine the view from up there, the city spread in its entirety, the river dividing Babylon into eastern and western halves, the palm groves beyond the walls giving way to the featureless plain, the horizon where armies appear as dust long before they arrive as threat. A boy approaches with a water skin, offering refreshment for a small coin, and you accept, drinking the lukewarm liquid that tastes of leather and the faint mineral of deep wells. He thanks you in Aramaic, the merchant tongue, and disappears into the crowd before you can respond, before you can determine whether he recognized you as foreign or simply addressed all customers in the most widely useful language. The sun climbs higher, and the shadows shorten, and the heat reaches its full intensity as the sun moves well past its initial emergence, beginning its long arc toward the western descent that will bring cooler hours, that will restore the river's influence over the city's temperature. You rise from your step, brushing the brick dust from your garments, and continue your movement through this place, this Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar II has made the wonder of his age, this capital of an empire that will endure another 61 years before the Persian conquest, before the Achaemenids absorb its achievements into their own, more diffused dominion. The street you enter now leads toward the palace district, and the quality of construction improves with each 100 paces, the brickwork tighter, the bitumen fresher, the decorative elements more prominent. Blue and yellow tiles frame doorways in geometric patterns that repeat and vary, that speak of workshops with established conventions and individual innovations. You pass through a market specializing in textiles, the hanging fabrics creating aisles of filtered light, red and purple, and the undyed cream of local wool. Merchants display their goods with formal eloquence, describing origins and techniques, invoking the names of distant production centers that mean quality and expense. The Euphrates River divides Babylon into eastern and western halves, and you remember that you began on the eastern bank, that you have crossed by the lesser gate, that you are now in the western city's commercial district, where the newer wealth congregates, where the beneficiaries of Nebuchadnezzar II's northern campaigns have built their houses and established their enterprises. The smell of cooking emerges from an alley, rich with cumin and coriander, and you realize that your morning's walking has extended toward midday, that the first meal is being prepared in kitchens throughout this vast settlement. The smoke from 10,000 cooking fires rises more densely now, the morning's scattered columns merging into a general haze that softens the outlines of taller structures, that lends the ziggurat a dreamlike indistinctness against the pale sky. You follow your hunger into the alley, find a cookshop where flatbread is being pulled from a clay oven, where lentil stew simmers in a pot tended by an old woman who accepts your small silver without comment, without the performance of gratitude that merchants offer to obvious wealth. You eat standing, as others do, the bread still warm, the stew spiced precisely, the heat of the food matching the heat of the day that now surrounds you. The mud that squelched underfoot on the towpath seems part of another journey, another season, though it was only hours ago, though the same sun that warmed it then warms you now. Time compresses in this city, layers upon layers of habitation, making each moment simultaneously ancient and immediate, the weight of all previous mornings pressing against the particularity of this one. Emerging from the alley, you find yourself approaching the palace complex itself, its walls rising in glazed splendor, their reliefs of lions and dragons visible even at distance, their colors preserved by the baking process that fixed them before setting. Nebuchadnezzar II came to power in 65 BCE after defeating Egyptian forces at Carchemish, and every surface of his residence proclaims that victory, extends it into permanent symbolic form, makes the temporary fact of battle into the enduring structure of legitimate rule. The Neo-Babylonian Empire found in this king its most articulate visual propagandist, its most thorough translator of violence into architecture. Guards here are more numerous, more ceremonially equipped, their weapons polished, their postures rigid with the self-consciousness of visible authority. You do not attempt to enter, content to observe from the plaza's edge, to note the comings and goings of officials, the arrival of messengers whose dust-covered garments speak of urgent travel, the departure of women in closed litters, bound for temple or family visit. The city contained numerous temples, palaces, and residential quarters connected by streets and canals, and you have now traversed representative examples of each, have felt in your feet the varying textures of their pavements, in your nostrils their characteristic scents, in your ears their distinctive acoustic properties. The afternoon advances, and the heat reaches its peak, and the distant clatter of bronze wheels on brick pavement high above sloes becomes intermittent, the patrols seeking shade, the messengers pausing at station houses. You find a bench beneath a tamarisk tree, its feathery foliage providing partial shelter, and you sit with the patience of one who has no appointment, no deadline, no purpose beyond observation and presence. The cool morning air rising from the river has become a memory, replaced by the dry warmth of full day, by the suspended stillness that precedes the evening's slight cooling. A lizard on the wall nearby pulses its throat, displaying for mate or warning arrival, its movements sharp against the glazed immobility of the brick. You watch it without urgency, your attention loose and drifting, catching the details that present themselves without seeking those that remain hidden. The mud brick construction of the lesser buildings around you shows here and there where rain has eroded the protective facing, where the core material begins to dissolve, where maintenance has been deferred or forgotten. Even in this city of wonders, the ordinary processes of decay continue, the entropy that no king's command can permanently arrest. The shadows lengthen, and the heat begins its slow withdrawal, and you rise again to continue your wandering. The streets you follow seem less crowded now, the siesta hours having emptied them of commerce, though in residential quarters you hear the sounds of waking, of preparation for the evening's activities, the second period of social engagement that divides Babylonian days. The wall appears again, closer than you expected, its mass suddenly present at the end of a narrowing street. You have walked a different route than your morning approach, emerged at a different point in the vast perimeter, and you study this section to understand its particularities, its variations on the general pattern of defense and display. The outer wall system, including moats, created multiple defensive layers visible here in their full extension, the water bright with reflected afternoon light, the spikes below the surface dark with shadow and algae. You find a crossing, a bridge for pedestrians where the main gate serves vehicles, and you pay the small toll from your diminishing store of coins. The guard here is elderly, his vigilance relaxed by years of uneventful service, and he waves you through with a gesture that acknowledges your harmlessness, your lack of significance to the security of the state. The passage through the wall is shorter here, the gate tower less elaborate, and you emerge quickly onto the eastern bank's quay, into the space where your morning began. The fishermen have departed, their day's work complete, their nets spread to dry on frames that lean against the reed thickets. The brown water continues its endless movement, carrying the city's effluent and the mountain sediment toward the southern sea that Babylonians know only by report, only by the accounts of traders who have ventured to its bitter, shoreless waters. You stand at the river's edge, and the cool evening air begins to rise, reversing the morning's thermal pattern, bringing the smell of water reeds and fish again across your face, restoring the sensory conditions of your arrival. The mud squelches underfoot on the towpath, though now it holds the warmth of the day, has not yet cooled to the morning's chill. You think of how the heat built in the dust as the sun cleared the eastern wall, and then you correct yourself, for the sun now descends toward that same wall, will soon touch its crest and sink behind it, will leave the sky in gradations of rose and amber that Babylonian poets have described in hymns to departing gods. The smoke from 10,000 cooking fires begins to rise more densely as households prepare their evening meals, and the smell of sesame oil drifts across the water, mixing with the river's own fragrances, creating the composite atmosphere of a city at day's end. You find a place to sit on the quay's edge, your feet dangling above the current, and you let the scene settle around you. The Neo-Babylonian Empire ended in 539 BCE with conquest by the Etemenids, but that ending is distant, unimaginable, separated from this evening by decades of continued power and construction, and the slow accumulation of challenges that will eventually prove overwhelming. For now, Babylon stands, and Nebuchadnezzar II reigns, and the river moves past in its eternal present, carrying away the day that has passed, bringing toward you whatever the next dawn will reveal. The light softens. The wall's shadow reaches toward you across the water. The first stars appear in the deepening vault above, and you watch them emerge one by one, identifying those that the priests have named, those that govern the calendar and the ritual cycle, those that have looked down on this city since before its founding and will continue after its eventual decline. You breathe slowly. The air moves across your face. The water murmurs below your feet, and somewhere a night bird begins its calling in the reeds. The city behind you settles into its nocturnal rhythms, the gates closing, the watchfires kindling, the last commerce concluding in whispered transactions. You remain, suspended between the day that ends and the night that begins, part of Babylon and separate from it, witness to its particular moment in the long sequence of human gathering and striving and eventual dispersal. The stars multiply. The wall becomes silhouette, then shadow, then mere absence against the starfield. The cool evening air rises from the river, carrying the smell of water reeds and fish across your face, and you feel the temperature drop degree by degree, feel your own warmth begin to dissipate into the larger coolness. Feel the boundaries between yourself and this place grow permeable, grow soft, grow indistinct. A fish jumps nearby, its ripple spreading to touch the bank where you sit, to disturb the reflection of stars on the water's surface, to restore for a moment the sense of living presence in this scene of stone and current and slowly wheeling sky. You watch the circles expand and fade, merge with the general movement of the river, become indistinguishable from the flow that continues regardless of individual disturbance. The night deepens. The mud underfoot has cooled completely now, has returned to the temperature it held when you first stepped onto this bank in the grey of dawn, has completed a cycle that will repeat and repeat while this city stands. You lie back on the quay's surface, the baked brick warm against your shoulders, your gaze lifting to the stars that continue their slow procession. The smoke from 10,000 cooking fires has dispersed, replaced by the sharper scent of extinguished hearths, of cooling ash, of the night-blooming flowers that open in courtyard gardens. The water sounds merge with the wind in the reeds. The stars seem to pulse faintly, their light reaching you across distances that dwarf the city's walls, that make even the 8 kilometers of the inner rampart seem a measurement of human scale against cosmic immensity. You breathe with the river's rhythm, in and out, your chest rising and falling in the darkness. Sleep comes gradually as the city's sounds diminish, as the night watch establishes its quieter regime, as your own awareness softens and spreads and loses its focus on particular things. The walls of Babylon, listed among the 7 wonders of the ancient world in older traditions, surround your unconscious body, protect your drifting attention, enclose the space in which your dreams will move. The river moves past. The reeds whisper. The stars turn in their ancient pattern, and you turn with them, released from the day's walking, from the morning's arrival, from the necessity of observation and movement. The cool air touches your face. The brick warms your back. The darkness receives you, gently, completely, into the rest that awaits. You are standing in a queue that stretches back along the processional way, somewhere between the river and the walls of Babylon. The delegation from Tyre has traveled for many weeks to reach this point, their ox carts laden with purple wool and cedar beams and ingots of silver that catch the morning light. Around you, the merchants speak in low voices, a mixture of Aramaic and Akkadian syllables that drift through the warming air like the dust raised by hooves and sandaled feet. You have waited here before, in the crowd, in the slow procession toward the gate that Nebuchadnezzar II built during his reign from 605 to 562 BCE. Though on this occasion the waiting feels longer, the sun more deliberate in its climb. The guards move from cart to cart with their bronze rods, tapping barrels and peering beneath woven covers. Their voices carry the flat authority of routine, the same questions asked 100 times each day at this entrance to the city. Cedar oil hangs in the air, sharp and clean, applied to the great hinges that allow the wooden doors to swing without groaning, without the orange stain of rust that would otherwise claim the metal within a single season. You smell it now, standing among the Tyrians, as the line shuffles forward and the shadow of the forward tower falls across your shoulders. The temperature drops suddenly as you pass beneath that shadow. The sunlit warmth of the processional way gives way to a cooler pocket of air trapped between the gate's 2 passages, between the smaller frontal gate and the larger rear passage that creates the Ben Taxis entrance designed for the city's defense. This architectural wisdom means no enemy could charge straight through. Any force would have to turn, would be exposed, would find themselves disoriented in this transitional space where light changes and sound behaves differently. Your footsteps begin to echo, though you have not yet entered the vaulted passage proper, the sound bouncing off stone that has known centuries of foot traffic, centuries of ceremony and commerce, and the ordinary movements of a living city. Ahead, the Tyrian delegation pauses as their lead cart is examined more thoroughly, the driver spreading his hands in the universal gesture of patience and compliance. You wait behind them, feeling the texture of the moment, the particular slowness of institutions that operate at the pace of oxen and manual inspection rather than haste. Somewhere above, pigeons murmur in the tower's crevices, their cooing barely audible over the human voices that fill this threshold space. Then the cart moves forward, and you move with it, and the light changes again. Emerging from the shadow of the forward tower, you step into the full brilliance of the glazed facade, and the world becomes color. Deep blue surrounds you, the blue of lapis lazuli, of distant mountains, of the sky just after sunset when the first stars begin to pierce the darkening dome. This blue was achieved by firing clay with mineral pigments, the cobalt carefully measured and applied, the bricks stacked and baked and stacked again, until the surface achieved this uniform, swimming depth. Against this blue, the animals stand in relief, bulls and dragons rendered in gold and other colors that seem to move in the flickering torchlight carried by attendants who pass between the towers. Over 100 relief animals adorn the gate's visible surfaces, repeating in rhythmic rows that suggest both abundance and order. The bulls, with their heavy shoulders and curved horns, represent Adad, the god of storms, whose power brings the rains that swell the rivers and fill the canals. The dragons, the M-US-Hatchek letter 1E2B, US-Hatchek, S-Hatchek-U with their serpentine bodies and forelegs raised, symbolize Marduk, patron deity of Babylon, the god in whose honor this entire complex of rebuilding and enlargement was undertaken on a site that had known earlier, humbler gates. You understand, standing before them, why the work required such sustained effort, why the inscription bands that run across the facade, in white and gold praise Nebuchadnezzar's building works with a pride that transcends mere boastfulness. The torchlight passes, and the gold seems to follow it, the animals appearing to shift and breathe in the uneven illumination. You reach out, drawn by the illusion of movement, and your fingers find the cool, glass-smooth surface of a dragon's flank where the glaze has pooled thicker in the recesses of the molded clay. The sensation is unlike anything else in the city, neither the porous warmth of ordinary brick nor the polished cold of stone, but something between, something manufactured through fire and chemistry and human patience. Thousands of fingernail-sized glaze imperfections texture the surface under your trailing hand, each one a record of the firing process, of the slight variations in heat and atmosphere that no artisan could fully control. You feel them now, these tiny irregularities, as your palm slides across the creature's body and the blue transfers its faint chill to your skin. Above your head, the structure rises approximately 14 meters, with towers rising higher still, their proportions calculated to impress upon approaching visitors the scale of Babylon's ambition and the reach of its king's authority. The original structure, built during Nebuchadnezzar II's reign from 605 to 562 BCE, formed part of Babylon's fortification system, yet it transcends mere utility in its ornamentation, in the transformation of defensive necessity into aesthetic statement. You look up at the towers, their silhouettes dark against the bright sky, and feel the weight of that vertical space pressing down even as your spirit lifts toward the decorated summit. Voices continue around you, the languages mixing in the barrel vault as more travelers press through from the processional way. Aramaic, the merchant tongue, predominates, but beneath it you catch the harder consonants of Akkadian, the administrative language of temple and palace, and occasionally the more exotic cadences of Elamite from the eastern mountains. These echoes layer upon each other, creating a texture of sound as complex as the visual surface of the gate itself, each voice carrying its own purpose, its own story of origin and destination. You stand within this acoustic environment, letting the syllables wash over you without grasping for meaning, experiencing them as pure pattern, as the auditory equivalent of the glazed brick's repetitive beauty. Priests in linen pass with incense, their white garments bright against the blue walls, their sandals making little sound on the paved floor. The smoke they carry is different from the cedar oil that scented the outer hinges, sweeter and more resinous, rising in thin columns that catch the light from the entrance and transform it into visible paths through the air. Their footsteps echo in the vaulted passage as they proceed toward the sacred precinct, the gate having performed its function of connection, having linked the secular bustle of the processional way to the ordered ritual space beyond. You watch them go, the smoke lingering after their forms have disappeared into the deeper shadows of the inner passage. The Tyrian delegation has moved ahead, their carts now cleared through the final inspection, and you find yourself alone for a moment in this transitional space, neither fully outside nor fully inside, held in the architecture's deliberate pause. The Bentaxis entrance continues to shape your experience, the turn required by the gate's design forcing you to reconsider your direction, to adjust your body and your expectations before proceeding. This was the intention of those who planned the rebuilding and enlargement of earlier gates on this same site, this manipulation of movement through space for purposes both practical and symbolic. You touch the dragon again, finding the same spot, confirming the persistence of its cool smoothness, the permanence of its mineral surface against the transience of your own warm presence. The glaze imperfections pattern your fingertips as they patterned your palm, a topography of the firing process that you can read now with repeated contact, can anticipate before your skin meets the surface. The torchlight has moved on, replaced by direct sunlight that enters at a steeper angle, and the gold of the animal reliefs responds with a different quality of brilliance, less mysterious than the flickering version, but more abundant, more democratic in its distribution across the decorated field. The inscription bands draw your eyes upward, the white and gold characters praising Nebuchadnezzar's building works with a formula that has become familiar through repetition across the city's monuments, yet retains its power through the very scale of its application. You cannot read every word from this position, the angle too steep, the distance too great, but you recognize the pattern of declaration, the royal voice asserting its achievements for posterity and for the gods who are the true audience of all such statements. The gate speaks in multiple registers, to multiple constituencies, its messages layered as its passages are layered, as its decorative programs are layered upon the essential structure of defense. Time passes in this space according to rhythms older than the individual life, older than the dynasty that built these walls. The queue behind you lengthens and shortens, the guards complete their inspections, the priests return and depart again with fresh incense, and you remain held by the completeness of the environment, by the saturation of sense that prevents easy extraction. The sharp scent of cedar oil reaches you again, carried on currents that move differently here than in the open street, constrained by the architecture into patterns of flow that the builders may or may not have anticipated. When you finally move forward, passing from the gate's middle space into the larger rear passage, the light changes once more, becoming more diffuse, filtered through the distance you have traveled from the entrance. Your footsteps echo differently here, the acoustics altered by the wider span of the vault, by the accumulated presence of more bodies in the expanded space. The priests in linen have gone ahead, their trail of incense grown too thin to follow, and you walk now among other travelers, other arrivals, the mixed voices of Aramaic, Akkadian, and Elamite continuing their polyphonic exchange around and through your own silent progress. The sacred precinct awaits, visible now as a brighter rectangle at the passage end, the ziggurat rising beyond it in stepped silhouette against the sky. But the gate retains its hold even as you leave it, the memory of its blue surfaces and golden animals persisting in your inner vision, the cool touch of the dragon's flank remaining in your palm like a secret knowledge, a private credential of having passed through this most famous of entrances. The rebuilding and enlargement that created this version of the gate, undertaken during Nebuchadnezzar II's reign from 605 to 562 BCE, will persist long after your passage, long after the particular Tyrian delegation has dispersed its goods and returned to the coast, long after the guards have changed and changed again into generations uncounted. You emerge into the full sun of the inner court, and the temperature rises, and the sounds change from echo to resonance, from the contained acoustics of the barrel vault to the open reverberation of paved plazas. Yet something of the gate accompanies you, some residue of its deliberate atmosphere, its calculated progression from outer to inner, from profane to sacred, from the common blue of sky to the achieved blue of fired cobalt and controlled mineral transformation. The cedar oil's sharp scent has faded from your awareness, replaced by the more general odors of a populated city. But you know it persists at the hinges, preventing rust, maintaining the mechanism by which the wooden doors swing open and closed upon this endless daily drama of arrival and inspection and passage. Later, much later, in temporal distances you cannot conceive, excavations by Robert Coldwell between 1899 and 1917 will reveal the gate's foundations and fragments, will recover enough of the glazed surface to permit reconstruction, will transport these materials to Berlin, where a version of the Ishtar Gate has been displayed in Berlin's Pergamon Museum since 1930. Visitors there will walk through a simulation of what you have experienced, will see the deep blue and the gold, will encounter the bulls of Adad and the dragons of Marduk in arrangements calculated to suggest the original's impact, if not its authenticity. The cobalt for blue, the antimony for yellow, will be analyzed and understood, the chemical knowledge preserved while the cultural knowledge surrounding it has necessarily diminished. But these futures do not concern you now, standing in the sacred precinct with the gate at your back, facing the ziggurat and the ceremonies that unfold around its base. The present moment extends in its particular quality, in the civilization that Nebuchadnezzar II extended and elaborated during his reign from 605 to 562 BCE. The glazed bricks retain their color in your memory, the animals their apparent movement, the inscription bands their white and gold assertion of royal achievement. You have touched the surface and been touched by it, have felt the temperature drop and rise again, have heard your footsteps echo and be absorbed into the greater echo of collective passage. The incense of the priests has dispersed entirely now, merged with the ambient atmosphere of temple and courtyard, but you recall its sweetness, its difference from the cedar oil's sharper note. The linen garments have disappeared into the crowd of worshippers and functionaries that fills the sacred space, their whiteness absorbed into the general brightness of midday. You stand among them, anonymous, arrived, the gate's function completed in your case, even as it continues to perform for those still queuing on the processional way, still passing through the smaller frontal gate, still turning in the Ben Taxis entrance designed for defense, still emerging into the full brilliance where the gold seems to move and the blue surrounds, and the animals of God and storm preside over every passage. The sun continues its arc. The shadows shift across the pavement, lengthening imperceptibly toward afternoon. The voices around you maintain their mixture, Aramaic for trade, Akkadian for ceremony, Elamite for the occasional Eastern visitor, all of them echoing in patterns that will persist as long as the city maintains its function, its role as gathering place and redistribution center, as the capital that Nebuchadnezzar II envisioned and largely achieved. You are part of this now, however temporarily, however provisionally, your presence recorded in no inscription band, yet real in the physical fact of your passage, your breathing, your continued existence within this space that has accepted you through the mechanism of its designed entrance. The cool of the dragon's flank fades slowly from your hand, warmed now by your own blood, by the sun, by the friction of movement resumed. The glaze imperfections have left no lasting impression, their pattern too fine, too superficial to mark the skin, yet something of their texture remains in your sensorium, a memory of manufactured smoothness, of the transformation of ordinary clay into this durable, luminous substance through the application of fire and mineral and human attention. You carry this knowledge forward into the precinct, into the continuing day, into the accumulation of experience that constitutes a life spent in proximity to such wonders, such deliberate constructions of meaning and material. The gate stands behind you, performing its eternal function, its approximately 14 meters of decorated height rising above the traffic of bodies and goods, its towers rising higher still, visible from points across the city as orientation and advertisement, as statement and shelter. The over 100 relief animals continue their silent vigil, the bulls of Adad and the dragons of Marduk repeating across the facade in rows that suggest both variety and unity, both the particular characteristics of each sculpted creature and the governing pattern that contains them all. The inscription bands continue their white and gold praise, readable or not depending on the viewer's position and literacy, present regardless as visual element, as structural band, as frame for the central spectacle of colored brick and molded relief. You do not look back, not yet, not finally. The precinct offers its own absorptions, its own sequence of spaces and experiences designed to culminate in the presence of the divine, in the encounter with Marduk himself, in whatever form he chooses to manifest. But the gate has prepared you for this, has slowed you, has turned you, has saturated your senses with its particular combination of color and texture and sound and scent, so that you enter the sacred space already transformed, already marked by passage through this most elaborate of thresholds. The cedar oil prevents rust at the hinges. The torches flicker and are replaced. The queue lengthens and shortens with the seasons, with the agricultural calendar, with the irregular pulse of long-distance trade. And you move forward into the brightness, into the continuing ceremony of a day that began with waiting on the processional way, and will extend through rituals and observations, and the gradual return toward ordinary life, toward evening, toward the rest that waits beyond the precinct, beyond the gate, in some chamber or courtyard where the stars will turn in their ancient pattern, and the cool air will touch your face, and the darkness will receive you, gently, completely, into the rest that awaits. The morning light falls upon the processional way where you have waited since the last chapter ended, and the street stretches before you like a river of pale stone flowing toward distant towers. You are standing at the threshold of Aber Shabu, the sacred path whose name means the enemy shall never pass, and the words settle upon your understanding with the weight of centuries. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt this avenue in the 6th century before the Common Era, and his ambition rises from every fitted slab beneath your feet. The processional way runs from the Ishtar gate to the temple complex of Esagilla, and you will walk its full measure today, 250 meters of deliberate magnificence, designed to overwhelm the eye and humble the spirit. Around you, the merchants are securing their awnings against the strengthening sun, and the first pilgrims of the day pass through the gate behind you with soft murmurs of greeting. The click of sandals on fitted stone reaches your ears, rhythmic as a metronome, as a temple servant hurries past with a bundle of reeds for some household purpose. You begin to walk, and the rhythm enters your own step, your own leather soles striking the brexia and limestone with small, distinct reports that echo faintly from the flanking walls. The pavement has been laid with extraordinary precision, each slab dressed and set so that no weed might find purchase. No unevenness disturb the solemn progress of divine images. To your left and right, the walls rise in glazed splendor, and the lions of Ishtar stride in eternal repetition, their bodies rendered in cobalt and turquoise against a ground of white and gold. Each lion passes in blue and white, muscular haunches tensed in perpetual motion, manes flowing in stylized waves that suggest wind without depicting it. You count them as you walk, and the counting becomes a meditation, a way of marking distance without urgency. Lion after lion passes beside you, and the glaze catches the morning light differently with each angle of approach. so that some beasts seem almost alive within a fire, while others recede into shadowed abstraction. The craftsmen who modeled these creatures worked from deep knowledge of the animal, yet filtered through theological necessity, and the result hovers between nature and symbol in a manner that unsettles clear categorization. White dust from the pavement has begun to whiten the hem of your linen robe, and you notice this gradually, as one notices the accumulation of any experience that becomes too familiar to remark upon immediately. The dust is fine, almost talc-like, ground from countless feet and years of ceremonial passage. It carries no scent of its own, yet it seems to hold something of the place, some mineral memory of processions long concluded. You brush at it absently, and the gesture repeats itself at intervals you do not measure, a small rhythm accompanying the larger rhythm of your walking. Pigeons coo in the niches between lion reliefs, their droppings streaking the glazed brick with organic patterns that contrast with the disciplined geometry of the decoration. The birds have found homes in the very monument that proclaims human dominion, and their presence softens the grandeur with something approaching domesticity. Their voices are low, conversational, the sound of creatures untroubled by the significance of their surroundings. You hear them as you pass, and then the sound fades behind you, replaced by new pigeons in new niches, the same yet different variations on an avian theme. The incense of cypress and myrrh drifts from temple doorways ahead, though you have not yet reached the great building itself. The scent arrives before any visible source, carried on air currents that move through the urban fabric with purposes of their own. It is clean, resinous, slightly medicinal in its austerity, nothing like the heavier perfumes of later traditions. This is the smell of ritual preparation, of spaces maintained in readiness for encounter with powers that demand particular atmospheres. You breathe it in, and your breathing slows to accommodate the tempo it seems to imply, unhurried, reverential, sustained. A file of priests approaches from the direction of Esagilla, moving against the flow of morning traffic with the confidence of those whose business takes precedence over ordinary commerce. They carry a gilded offering table between them, its surface loaded with vessels that catch and scatter the light into mobile constellations. You step aside as they pass, pressing yourself briefly against the cool wall with its ceramic menagerie, and the lions press back against your shoulder blades with their immutable presence. The priests do not acknowledge you, their attention fixed upon the balance of their burden, upon the precise placement of each foot to preserve the dignity of their progress. Their sandals make the same clicking music as yours, but gathered now into unison, 4 beats where yours is 1. Then they are past, and the space they occupied fills again with ordinary air, ordinary light, the moment of their passage becoming memory even as it concludes. You resume your walking, and the processional way continues to unfold before you with the patience of something that knows it will outlast all who traverse it. Nebuchadnezzar's name comes to mind, and you hold it there, considering the king who conceived this thoroughfare, who directed its construction across years of labor and expense. The enemy shall never pass. This was his declaration, embedded in the very name of the street, and you wonder what enemies he imagined, whether military or spiritual, whether human or divine. The ambiguity seems intentional, a multivalence that allows the inscription to resonate across circumstances its author could not foresee. The walls begin to show greater variation in their decorative program as you advance, and you observe that the striding lions alternate with other motifs, rosettes, and geometric borders that frame and punctuate the animal procession. The symbolism of Ishtar permeates everything, her animal emblem repeated until it becomes environment rather than sign, the medium through which meaning flows rather than meaning itself. Yet each lion retains individual character in its modeling, some fierce, some contemplative, some seeming almost playful in the set of their jaws or the curl of their tails. The craftsmen worked within convention, but never surrendered entirely to it, and their small resistances reward attentive passage. The heat of the day builds incrementally, and the blue of the glazed brick seems to intensify under the direct sun, becoming almost luminous in its saturation. You have been walking perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps 15, time measured not by instruments, but by the accumulation of observed detail, the slow saturation of attention. The processional way demands this temporal investment, was designed to require it, and you give yourself to the requirement without resentment, finding in surrender a kind of freedom that hurried destinations cannot provide. Esagilla becomes visible ahead, its ziggurat rising in stepped stages against the pale sky, the temple proper spreading at its base in courts and chambers that extend beyond your immediate perception. The name means house of the raised head in Sumerian, and you speak the syllables internally, feeling their strangeness and their appropriateness, the image of lifting, of elevation, of attention directed upward. This is where the processional way leads, where it has always led, where Nebuchadnezzar intended it to lead when he rebuilt Aber-Shabu in the splendor that surrounds you now. The final stretch of the avenue opens into a broader space, a plaza where the paved way meets the temple precinct, and here the crowd thickens with those who have business in the holy place or who come simply to witness, to absorb, to remember. You move among them, and your anonymity feels like a gift, the possibility of observation without obligation, of presence without performance. The click of sandals on fitted stone surrounds you from many directions now, multiplied into polyrhythm individual walkers contributing their solitary beats to an emergent whole that no single consciousness composes. You pass through the outer gate of the temple complex, and the quality of sound changes immediately, enclosed spaces replacing open sky, echoes becoming more pronounced and more complex. The courtyard before you contains a central altar of whitewashed brick, and around it doves circle in slow, irregular orbits, their wings making soft percussive sounds as they break and turn. The birds are not precisely domesticated, yet they belong here, fed by temple servants, accustomed to human presence without being claimed by it. Their flight patterns trace invisible geometries above the altar, and you stand for a moment simply watching, allowing your eyes to follow without interpreting, to receive without structuring. The incense of cypress and myrrh is stronger here, drifting from temple doorways that open directly onto this court, and the scent seems to thicken the air, to give it texture and resistance that ordinary atmosphere lacks. You move through it as through water, slowly, with deliberate grace, conscious of each limb's extension and retraction. White dust from the pavement has continued to whiten the hem of your linen robe, and you notice again, with fresh surprise, how the place marks its visitors, how departure would carry evidence of presence into whatever future awaits beyond these walls. A priest crosses the courtyard with a vessel of water, his movements economical, his gaze fixed on some middle distance that excludes your existence. You follow him with your eyes, tracking his progress toward a doorway from which lamplight flickers despite the brightness of morning. The daily life of Esagilla proceeds according to schedules established long before your arrival, and you are peripheral to it, a witness without function, a consciousness adrift in operations that require no collaboration. This peripherality suits you, allows the relaxation of social muscle, the cessation of performance that ordinary intercourse demands. You find a bench of baked brick beneath a partial awning, and you rest there as the afternoon heat stills all but essential movement. The bench is warm from previous occupants, and the warmth communicates something of their recent presence, a ghost of body heat that lingers in the material world. Around you, the temple complex reveals itself in fragments, a kitchen where bread is being prepared for offering, a storehouse where vessels are inventoried, a workshop where ritual equipment receives repair. Esagilla employs hundreds of people in these various crafts and services, and their collective labor sustains the possibility of proper relation between human and divine, maintains the infrastructure of worship with the same practical attention that any large enterprise requires. The economic operations of the temple are not hidden from you, though they are not displayed for edification either. They simply exist, visible through open doorways, audible in the clatter of pottery and the murmur of instruction. You observe a young apprentice learning to shape a censer from raw clay, his hands uncertain, his teacher's hands guiding with practiced patience. The object they produce will enter service before Marduk's image, will carry incense of cypress and myrrh in its bowl, will participate in ceremonies that transcend its material modesty. This continuity between ordinary making and sacred use characterizes the place, dissolves boundaries that later traditions might enforce more rigidly. Your rest continues, and the heat seems to slow even thought, to reduce mental activity to essential currents without turbulence. Pigeons coo in niches you cannot see, their voices reaching you across the courtyard with the intimacy of sounds that have traveled far to arrive. Their droppings streak unseen glazed brick, and you imagine the pattern, the organic geometry of chance deposited upon the calculated regularity of human design. The temple tolerates this intervention, incorporates it into its ongoing existence, neither prevents nor hastens the slow accumulation of natural process upon cultural foundation. From your bench, you observe the entrance to the inner sanctuary, the cella where Marduk's statue resides in darkness pierced by ritual lamplight. You will not enter there, the privilege reserved for ordained personnel, but you know what occurs within, know from report and from imagination. The daily washing and dressing of Marduk's statue constitutes the central act of temple maintenance, the care of the divine body that enables its continued presence among humans. Priests perform this service with the devotion of attendants to a living monarch, and the metaphor of kingship extends to every detail of preparation and presentation. You imagine the scene, the statue removed from its pedestal, the old garments carefully folded away, the surface washed with water prepared according to ancient prescription, the new garments donned with incantation and gesture. The cult statue of Marduk and his consort Zarpanitu receives this attention together, the divine couple maintained in state that mirrors and exceeds any earthly partnership. Their images are not merely representations, but presences, locations where deity becomes accessible to sensory encounter, where the distant becomes proximate without losing its essential transcendence. The afternoon advances, and the angle of light shifts across the courtyard, altering shadows, revealing textures previously concealed. The doves continue their circling, and you note how their patterns change with the sun's movement, how living things respond to cosmic rhythms with unconscious fidelity. The central altar receives occasional visitors who leave small offerings, whisper prayers, depart with expressions of private satisfaction or unresolved longing. You do not approach the altar yourself, content with your position at the margin, your role as observer sustained beyond any need for participation. Musicians enter the courtyard, and their instruments precede them in description if not in actual sound. Drums of stretched hide, lyres of wood and gut, flutes of bone and reed. They are rehearsing, you understand, preparing for some ceremony that will require their art, and their presence anticipates events not yet visible. The procession of the New Year festival, the Akitu, will follow this route when Nisan arrives, the spring month when all creation renews itself. 12 days the festival lasts, 12 days of elaborate ritual that sees Marduk's statue carried along the processional way from Esagilla to the house of celebration and back again. You hold this future knowledge as you sit, allowing it to color your perception of present emptiness. The way that seems so spacious now, so available for solitary walking, will become crowded, charged with significance, transformed by the presence of the divine image and its attendants. Musicians, Singers and bearers of costly offerings will constitute that procession, and their combined movement will constitute a social body of extraordinary density and purpose. The festival exists in potential, even in its absence, prepared for in routines like this rehearsal, anticipated in structures like this courtyard, designed to accommodate its manifestation. King Nebuchadnezzar himself participated in the Akitu ceremonies, you recall, and the image of absolute power submitting to ritual humiliation returns to your consideration. The stripping and humbling of the king before Marduk's image enacted a theology in which even earthly sovereignty derived from and remained accountable to divine authority. The great king laid aside his regalia, confessed his failings, accepted temporary diminishment as the price of continued legitimacy. This was not mere symbolism, but effective action, a transaction that renewed cosmic order through the willingness of power to acknowledge its source. You consider the courage such ritual required, or the system that made it possible, or the faith that sustained both. The afternoon heat stills all but essential movement, and your thinking slows to match the tempo of your surroundings, becoming contemplative rather than analytical, receptive rather than interrogative. The bench supports your weight without complaint, and the brick retains its warmth even as the sun begins its decline, as shadows lengthen across the courtyard with perceptible gradualness. A priest emerges from the cella, and his expression suggests the completion of some demanding service, the relief of responsibility temporarily discharged. He does not look toward you, moves across the courtyard with the inward focus of those whose labor has been intense, whose rest is earned. You watch him vanish into the warren of chambers that constitutes the temple's domestic quarter, the kitchens and storehouses and workshops for ritual equipment that maintain the material basis of sacred operation. Hundreds of people are employed in these functions, you remember, and their collective industry sustains what isolated devotion could not. The daily offerings of bread, beer, and meat before the divine images proceed according to schedule, and though you do not observe them directly, you know their occurrence, sense their rhythm as background to your rest. The priests who perform these offerings inherit generations of prescribed gesture, of formulaic utterance, of exact measurement and timing. The bread is fresh, the beer foaming, the meat prepared with attention to quality that marks its destination. What is consumed by the god, through mysterious processes that theology elaborates, but does not fully explain. What remains feeds the temple staff, closes a circuit of exchange that binds divine and human economies into unified system. Your linen robe has dried to stiffness where perspiration marked it, and the white dust from the pavement shows more clearly now in angled light, a pale border defining your temporary presence in this permanent place. You brush at it with diminished energy, the gesture become more symbolic than effective, a small maintenance of personal boundary against environmental claim. The temple does not distinguish between visitor and resident in its marking, applies its dust impartially to all who walk its ways, and this impartiality feels somehow just, a democratic principle operating through physical rather than political mechanism. The doves have settled upon the altar, their circling concluded for this interval, and they preen and murmur in the complacency of creatures whose needs are regularly met. You observe their small societies, the pecking orders literal and hierarchical, the brief squabbles that resolve into renewed equilibrium. The central altar serves them as perch, as they serve it with the fertilization of their presence, the organic contribution that exceeds their awareness. The temple incorporates such contributions into its ecology, neither pure nor impure in categories that would exclude natural process from sacred space. Incense of cypress and myrrh drifts again from temple doorways, and you recognize in its recurrence the pattern of daily observance, the scheduled replenishment of atmospheric sanctity. The scent reaches you in waves, stronger then fainter, modulated by air movement you cannot predict or control. You receive it as you receive all sensory experience here, without demand for consistency, without frustration at variation. The drift of cypress and myrrh becomes a kind of language, articulating presence and absence, approach and retreat, in syntax older than any verbal formulation. The processional way lies behind you now, its lions past, its pavement traversed, yet it persists in memory as palimpsest upon present perception. You carry the image of striding lions in blue and white, the rhythm of your own walking, the click of sandals on fitted stone. These impressions will remain, you suspect, longer than factual information, longer than the names and dates that anchor historical understanding. The sensory particularity of passage has inscribed itself in ways that resist deliberate recall, yet persist in involuntary activation, emerging in dreams or distracted moments with the vividness of lived experience. Your bench has become familiar through duration of contact, and the brick conforms to your posture with the accommodation of materials that receive repeated pressure. You shift slightly, and the unfamiliar angle reveals new aspects of the courtyard. A drainage channel carved with protective symbols, a foundation deposit whose contents remain buried and secret, a patch of newer brick where repair has occurred. The temple maintains itself through such interventions, renews its fabric while preserving its form, and you observe in this maintenance a model for personal continuity, for the preservation of identity across necessary change. The afternoon extends, and the heat begins to moderate with the sun's westerning, though the baked surfaces of courtyard and building retain warmth that will dissipate only gradually into evening coolness. You feel this retention in the bench against your back, in the wall you touch experimentally with extended fingertips. The thermal mass of Esagilla equals its spiritual mass, its capacity to sustain conditions beyond the fluctuations that affect lighter structures. The temple complex persists through temperature cycles, through seasonal variation, through the longer rhythms of political and cultural transformation that have seen empires rise and fall while worship continued. Pigeons coo in niches between lion reliefs, and you hear them now from the direction of the processional way, the sound carrying across distance with unexpected clarity. Their droppings streak the glazed brick, and you imagine the pattern accumulating, the slow alteration of appearance through biological process, the eventual cleaning or acceptance of this modification. The temple exists in time as well as eternity, and its material form bears the marks of temporal passage even as its function claims transcendent reference. You rise from your bench with the deliberation that prolonged rest makes necessary, joints adjusting, circulation restoring, consciousness reorienting from horizontal to vertical engagement with space. The courtyard offers multiple directions, multiple possibilities for continuation, and you choose without urgency, following the drift of incense and sound toward an opening that reveals further extension of the complex. Esagilla means house of the raised head, and you feel the appropriateness of the name in your own cranial adjustment, the slight lift of attention that new movement requires. The kitchen area reveals itself in controlled chaos, bread being shaped for tomorrow's offerings, beer fermenting in sealed vessels, meat receiving preliminary preparation. The servants here work with the proficiency of repetition, their movements economical, their conversation sparse and functional. You observe without intruding, maintaining the peripheral status that has characterized your entire presence in this place. A storehouse door stands open, and you glimpse the systematic arrangement of vessels, textiles, precious materials that constitute the temple's accumulated wealth. The economic operations of Esagilla require such storage, such inventory, such careful management of resource across time. Hundreds of people are employed in these crafts and services, and their coordination demands administrative structures that mirror secular bureaucracy while serving sacred purpose. You do not enter the storehouse, respect the boundary between observation and interference, but you carry away the image of ordered abundance, of provision made against future need. The workshop for ritual equipment produces sounds of active craft, hammer on metal, chisel on wood, the softer abrasion of polishing. You approach near enough to observe through doorway, a craftsman repairing a damaged censer, another fashioning new ornaments for some approaching ceremony. Their products will enter the cycle of offering and consumption, will participate in ceremonies that maintain cosmic order through correct performance. The continuity between this making and that using extends across space and time in ways that individual consciousness cannot fully trace. Yet the connection exists, is real, is maintained through just such daily labor as you witness. The afternoon has advanced significantly, and the light assumes the golden quality that precedes evening, enriching colors, softening edges, lending to all surfaces a warmth that seems to emanate from within rather than merely reflect external illumination. The temple complex enters this transitional phase with the equanimity of structures that have experienced countless such transitions, that exist in rhythms larger than any single day yet, include each day in their comprehensive pattern. You find yourself returning toward the courtyard, toward the central altar where doves still maintain their station, though in reduced numbers as evening approaches. The birds that circled earlier have dispersed to roosting places, and the remaining few are settling into postures of rest, heads tucked, feathers fluffed against cooling air. The central altar stands empty now of active worship, its surface bearing only the traces of earlier offering, the residue of transactions between human and divine that will resume tomorrow with the renewal of daily sequence. The click of sandals on fitted stone reaches you from somewhere in the complex, rhythmic and steady, but you cannot locate its source, whether approaching or receding, whether priest or pilgrim or servant about some necessary errand. The sound evokes your own walking of the processional way, the passage from Ishtar Gate to Esagilla that constituted your morning's journey. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt that way, you remember, and his name arises with the freshness of recent learning rather than the dimness of distant report. The enemy shall never pass. His declaration, his confidence, his theological political statement embedded in infrastructure. You stand in the courtyard as the light continues its westward shift, as shadows extend and merge, as the temperature drops with perceptible slowness toward the cooler hours of evening. The doves upon the altar have become still, their forms merging into grey shapes against greying stone, their presence becoming indistinguishable from the architecture they inhabit. You feel the day concluding in your own body, the accumulated fatigue of walking and watching and waiting settling into limbs and eyelids with the gentleness of legitimate weariness. The musicians have departed, their rehearsal complete, their instruments silenced until some future summons. The priests have withdrawn to their quarters, the servants to their rest, the pilgrims to their lodgings beyond the precinct. You remain, the last or nearly the last, held by something you cannot name, some completion not yet arrived, some fullness of experience that resists premature departure. The courtyard empties of purposeful movement, and the stillness that replaces it seems not vacant but expectant, a held breath before some transition you sense but cannot predict. Incense of cypress and myrrh drifts once more, fainter now, the last observance of day rather than the first, a valediction rather than a greeting. You receive it with the gratitude of one who has been sustained by sensory richness across long hours, who has found in external stimulation the nourishment that internal rumination cannot provide. The scent carries you backward through the day, to morning at the Ishtar Gate, to the first steps upon Shabu, to the lions passing in blue and white, to the moment when you understood that the enemy shall never pass and wondered what enemy, what passage, what permanence might mean in a world of necessary change. You move toward the gate through which you entered, finding your way by memory and by the fading light, by the residual warmth of stone and the cooling of air. The processional way lies before you in reverse, the path of return that completes every journey, the necessary counterpart to arrival. You will walk it now in evening, and the lions will appear different in declining light, their cobalt deepened toward violet, their gold subdued to amber, their eternal striding shadowed by the approach of night. The pavement will receive your footsteps with the same precision as in morning, the same fitted slabs, the same absence of weed or unevenness, the same dedication to perfect passage that Nebuchadnezzar demanded and received. The gate approaches, and beyond it the city, and beyond the city the plain, and beyond the plain the horizon where earth and sky dissolve into each other with the ambiguity that governs all boundaries. You carry Esagilla with you now, its kitchens and workshops, its doves and pigeons, its priests and servants, its incense and dust, its rhythms of observance and rest. The temple has entered your memory as it enters the memory of all who pass through, becoming part of the structure of experience against which future experience will be measured, the standard of significant place that other places will approximate or fail. You pass through the outer gate, and the sound changes again, open sky returning, echoes dispersing, the world becoming larger and less defined. The plaza spreads before you, emptier than in morning, the crowd dispersed to evening meals and preparations. The processional way stretches behind you and before you. It's 250 meters now, a memory of walking and a promise of further walking. A line drawn through the city that connects points of significance without exhausting their meaning. The stars are not yet visible, but you know they will emerge, that the ancient pattern of their turning will resume as it has resumed across millennia, indifferent to the comings and goings below. The measured patience of stone absorbs afternoon into evening. Your shadow has lengthened across the courtyard of Esagilla, that great temple of Marduk whose presence dominates the religious life of Babylon. The priests have withdrawn to their private chambers, leaving only a single acolyte to tend the eternal flame near the inner sanctum. You feel the residual warmth of sun-baked brick rising through the soles of your sandals, that baked smell of ancient brick heating in noon sun, now slowly cooling into something earthier, more like stored memory than immediate sensation. The processional way lies behind you, its glazed lions and dragons already slipping into the blue-gray of approaching dusk. Before you rises another structure entirely, one that commands a different order of attention. You turn toward it now, your neck tilting backward almost of its own accord, your eyes seeking its limits against the darkening vault above. Etemenanki. The name arrives in your mind with the weight of invocation rather than mere reference. The Sumerian phrase preserves something primordial in its syllables, something closer to the first human impulse toward verticality, toward bridging the gap between what stands beneath our feet and the wheeling immensity that receives our upward gaze. You are standing at the base, craning upward where the first terrace already blocks half the sky. The platform before you extends 90 meters in each direction, though from your position at its northern corner, the true dimensions reveal themselves only gradually, only as you walk along its face, and the perspective shifts to disclose new angles of mass and proportion. The ziggurat was dedicated to Marduk in the 6th century BCE, and dedication here implies something more than modern ceremonial custom might suggest. It implies the god's actual habitation, his periodic descent to inhabit this constructed mountain, this artificial cosmos in miniature. The structure likely rose between 50 and 90 meters in its completed form, and standing before its lowest visible level, you find the upper range easier to credit than the lower. So thoroughly does it dominate the horizontal spread of the city around it. Dust rises from the baked surface where workmen have recently completed some repair, some reinforcement of the facing that the winter rains threatened. The core was sun-dried brick, faced with fired brick to protect from rain, and you can trace with your eye the boundary between these two orders of material, where a section of facing has fallen away to expose the darker, more vulnerable substance beneath. Bitumen waterproofing was applied between courses, and in places where the afternoon sun strikes obliquely, you detect the faint sheen of that petroleum residue, black as the waters of the nearby Euphrates during flood season. The smell reaches you too, not unpleasant but unmistakably chemical, the olfactory signature of Mesopotamian engineering adapting itself to a climate of rare precipitation and violent downpour. Wind moves across the open plaza, carrying with it the distant sounds of the harbor district where boats are being secured for the night. The cold air moves across your face. You pull your cloak more closely about your shoulders, though the exertion of your earlier walking has left a residual warmth in your limbs that will persist until you stop moving entirely. Around you, the last merchants are packing their wares from the small market that operates at the ziggurate's foot, selling offerings and amulets to those who come to pray or to marvel. Their voices carry a particular quality of attenuation, as if the scale of what towers above them has diminished their ordinary human volume to something provisional, something that the architecture tolerates rather than accommodates. Earlier versions existed from at least the old Babylonian period, rebuilt after damage, and you recall that this very massif has risen and risen again across centuries of political convulsion. Hammurabi knew an ancestor of this structure. The Kassite kings maintained it. Sennacherib's destruction was itself destroyed by time and by the subsequent determination of those who worshipped here to restore what conquerors had defaced. Nebuchadnezzar left inscriptions claiming restoration work, and his voice seems particularly present in the precision of these fired bricks, in the regularity of courses that speak of imperial resources deployed without stinting. The enemy shall never pass. His declaration from the processional way acquires additional resonance here, where the vertical axis supplements the horizontal defense, where height itself becomes a theological political statement embedded in infrastructure. You approach the ramp's entrance, a portal framed by modest columns that support nothing but symbolic lintel, pure architectural gesture. A spiral wound around the exterior or passed through the interior, and scholarly disagreement persists regarding which configuration obtained at which historical moment. The present ramp appears to follow the exterior path, coiling about the mass like a serpent of baked clay, ascending toward an unimaginable head. You set your foot upon its surface, feeling the slight give of bitumen-sealed brick under pressure, and begin to climb. Each successive story was smaller than the one below, creating a stepped pyramid, and this mathematical diminishment governs your progress in ways you only gradually apprehend. The ramp turns, and with each turn reveals more of the city's sprawl below, the urban fabric of Babylon spreading outward in its rectangular logic, its canals catching the last light like threads of molten copper sewn across a field of dun and ochre. You pass the level of the surrounding buildings, then the level of the date palms that mark the canal edges, then the level of the highest crenellations of the outer walls. The wind increases with each level, snapping the hem of your cloak against your legs with a rhythm almost musical in its regularity. Your breathing adjusts to the incline, finding a slower tempo that matches the ramp's gentle gradient. The architects understood the pace of pilgrimage, the necessary intervals of approach that transform mere arrival into something earned, something prepared for. You count your paces unconsciously, losing exact tally in the absorption of prospect, in the gradual revelation of distance conquered and distance remaining. A dog barks somewhere far below, its sound thinned to a needle of auditory information against the broader texture of evening settling over the plain. The second terrace arrives without dramatic announcement, its platform extending perhaps 60 meters per side, its surface occupied by small structures whose function you cannot immediately determine. Storage, perhaps, for the materials of maintenance and ceremony. shelters for those who keep watch through the night against fire or intrusion. You continue without pausing, your legs finding their rhythm, your eyes drawn always upward to where the next turn will disclose what remains concealed. By the third terrace, the wind has acquired personality, pressing against your forward movement with something like playful resistance, then withdrawing to allow you sudden ease, then returning from a different quarter to test your balance. The cold air moves across your face with greater insistence here, carrying scents from levels of atmosphere untroubled by the city's cooking fires and stable yards. You smell something mineral, something that belongs to the upper air exclusively, the olfactory equivalent of the silence that expands as human habitation recedes below. The reduction in platform area becomes palpable now, the available surface for walking narrowing to a corridor of precise dimension, the drop to either side increasingly immediate, increasingly vertiginous in implication, if not yet in actual sensation. You rest briefly at the corner where the ramp turns toward the south, your hand finding the coping that borders the terrace edge. The baked smell of ancient brick heating in noon sun has entirely dissipated now, replaced by the cooler odor of massy construction releasing its stored warmth into the advancing evening. Below, the first lamps are being lit in the streets you traversed hours before, their illumination too scattered to constitute pattern, yet sufficient to mark the arteries of movement, the channels of evening commerce and domestic return. The Euphrates catches what remains of daylight in a band of tarnished silver, its course visible from this elevation as it was not visible from the ground, its serpentine geometry declaring the reason for this city's existence, this city's persistence across millennia of human endeavor. You resume climbing. The fourth terrace presents itself through the medium of shadow, the sun having descended sufficiently to leave this height in the condition of twilight, while the plain below still receives direct illumination. This differential of light creates a strange effect of temporal dislocation, as though you have climbed not merely through space, but into an earlier phase of evening, a pocket of preserved dusk. The wind now requires you to gather the fabric of your cloak in one hand to prevent its interference with your footing. The ramp's surface has grown slippery with the condensation of atmospheric moisture on cooling brick, and you proceed with deliberate care, placing each foot with explicit intention. Sudden vertigo at an unguarded edge, the city reduced to colored tiles. You have paused too near the perimeter, allowing your eye to travel the vertical drop without the mediation of intervening structure. The perspective rushes upon you with physiological urgency, your inner ear protesting the discrepancy between apparent and actual stability. You step back, press your palm against the solid mass of the ziggurate's flank, breathe deliberately until the equilibrium returns. The city reduced to colored tiles. This diminishment is also an aesthetic transformation, the human drama below abstracted to pattern, to mosaic, to something a god might view without particular engagement of sympathy or concern. You understand something of divine distance in this moment, something of the necessary remove that worship both bridges and preserves. The fifth terrace arrives as a destination almost unexpected, your concentration on physical negotiation having displaced awareness of overall progress. You rest there as wind carries the sound of a distant bronze trumpet from the palace, its note arriving with the delay of spatial separation, its timbre thinned by the intervening atmosphere to something pure and signal-like, stripped of harmonic complexity. The palace complex lies to your left, its own terraced gardens visible as a hanging ambiguity of vegetation against mud brick, its famous cascade of greenery still luminous in the last direct light. The trumpet speaks again, perhaps announcing some court ceremony, some transition of watch or meal, some ritual whose meaning belongs to the enclosed world of power rather than to the open structure of devotion you presently occupy. Etemenanki means house of the foundation of heaven and earth in Sumerian, and the foundation here is not merely literal, not merely the platform that supports physical weight. It is the foundation of cosmic order itself, the axial point where the vertical and horizontal planes of existence intersect and confirm each other. You sit upon a bench of baked brick, its surface still retaining sufficient warmth to comfort against the advancing chill. According to ancient accounts, the summit once held a temple chamber with a bed and table said to be for Marduk's nightly visitation. And though that chamber, if it existed, still lies above you, invisible from your present position, you might imagine its presence as a gravitational center, a focus of spiritual density that draws attention upward even as your body demands rest. The first stars appearing in a sky still pale blue, seen from the upper terraces, announce themselves individually rather than in the profusion of full darkness. You identify Venus, then Jupiter, then a third point of light whose identity you cannot determine without further observation. The sky holds these emergent luminaries with a tenderness almost maternal, not yet releasing them to the absolute black of midnight. You watch the transition with the patience of one who has nowhere else to be, no other appointment than this continuing ascent, this progressive approximation of the celestial realm. Your legs tremble slightly as you rise to continue, the accumulated fatigue of climbing combining with the cooling temperature to stiffen muscle and tendon. The sixth terrace reveals itself in the gathering darkness as a mere shelf, a preparation for the final ascent rather than a destination in itself. The ramp's curvature tightens here, coiling toward the summit with the urgency of approaching completion. You place your feet with greater care, the reduced visibility demanding tactile confirmation of what visual inspection can no longer reliably provide. The bitumen between courses seems to drink what little light remains, creating a surface texture of variable friction that keeps your attention focused on immediate navigation. You are imagining the vanished summit chamber, its cedar roof open to stars, when the final terrace delivers you to the platform's ultimate level. The space is smaller than you anticipated, intimate after the expansive substructures below, a room rather than a plaza. The cedar roof, you imagine, would have been supported by beams now long decayed, would have framed a rectangle of sky, precisely calculated to admit certain stars at certain seasons, to create a calendar of light and shadow that governed the agricultural and ritual year. Its cedar roof open to stars. The phrase repeats in your mind with the quality of incantation, summoning what no longer exists into the virtual presence of imaginative reconstruction. You move to the platform's center, where a low pedestal marks the position of the god's bed, the place where Marduk would descend to rest, to receive the ministry of priests, to confirm by his temporary residence the bond between celestial authority and terrestrial submission. The table beside it would have held offerings of food and drink, the sustenance appropriate to divine embodiment, the practical acknowledgement that even gods require material substrate for their manifestation in human experience. You stand in this vanished configuration, your body occupying the space where priestly bodies once arranged themselves in patterns of extreme deliberation, where every gesture carried cosmological weight, where the distinction between performance and reality dissolved in the intensity of shared belief. The first stars appearing in a sky still pale blue have multiplied in the interval of your contemplation, the sky's color deepening toward indigo at the zenith while preserving its luminous margin at the western horizon. You turn slowly, identifying the cardinal points by their characteristic constellations, feeling in this rotation the ghost of ritual movement, the circumambulation that would have accompanied prayer or divination. You are inside that meaning now, contained within it, sustained by the conceptual architecture that the physical architecture merely instantiated. Cold has penetrated your clothing, finding the passages between fabric and flesh that exertion had kept sealed. The wind at this elevation moves without obstruction, carrying the distant sounds of the city below as mere rumor, mere suggestion of continued human activity in a realm now separated from your own by vertical distance and devotional purpose. You think of Nebuchadnezzar, of his inscriptions claiming restoration work, of his ambition to make permanent what time and politics continually threatened. The enemy shall never pass. His declaration from the horizontal realm of the processional way achieves here a supplementary meaning. The enemy defined not merely as military force, but as entropy itself, as the tendency of all construction toward dissolution, of all meaning toward forgetfulness. The Greek historian Herodotus described a tower at Babylon, possibly this one, in the 5th century BCE, and you wonder what he actually saw, what stage of ruin or restoration obtained during his visit. His description carries the quality of hearsay modified by autopsy, the uncertain blend of reported marvel and personal observation that characterizes ancient ethnography. The structure he encountered may have been substantially complete, its summit chamber still functional, its spiral ramp still bearing the traffic of priests and pilgrims. Or he may have seen already the beginnings of decline, the cracks in facing that presaged eventual collapse, the reduction of active cult to nostalgic commemoration. Some scholars consider Etemenanki a model for the biblical Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis 11:1-9, and the correspondence may resonate with readers familiar with ancient Near Eastern history. The confusion of tongues, the dispersal of unified humanity into mutual unintelligibility. These narrative elements find their architectural correlative in this very ascent, in the progressive isolation that altitude imposes, the way each higher level reduces the community of climbers to fewer and fewer individuals, until the summit itself accommodates only the singular devotee, the privileged mediator between human and divine. The narrative in Genesis transforms what was likely a local Babylonian tradition into universal myth, projecting onto this specific structure the anxiety of all human ambition, all technological hubris, all aspiration toward the heavens that forgets its proper terrestrial limitation. You descend at evening, legs trembling from the height and the long descent, the physical consequence of your exertion making itself felt in the altered mechanics of downward movement. The ramp that seemed gentle in ascent reveals its true gradient now, each step requiring controlled surrender to gravity, the braking effort of thigh and calf against the acceleration of falling. You move slowly, deliberately, respecting the fatigue that could so easily translate into misstep, into the sudden conversion of vertical advantage into terminal velocity. You pause at the 6th terrace to observe this transition, to allow your body partial recovery before the continuation of descent. The wind has diminished somewhat with your lowered elevation, though it still moves with sufficient force to remind you of your exposed position, your continued vulnerability to the elemental conditions of this artificial mountain. The 5th terrace receives you with almost familiar comfort, its associations of rest and trumpet sound returning as you recognize the bench where you sat, the corner where you turned. The city below has transformed entirely into a constellation of artificial lights, the canals invisible, the walls marked only by the spacing of watchfires. You continue downward, your knees protesting the repetitive impact, your hands finding the coping more frequently for support and guidance. Sudden vertigo at an unguarded edge, the city reduced to colored tiles. This sensation threatens again at the 4th terrace, where the ramp's turn exposes you to the full drop without psychological preparation. You anticipate it now, brace against it, transfer your gaze quickly to the horizontal plane of the terrace surface until the internal equilibrium reasserts itself. The city reduced to colored tiles has become still more abstract in full darkness. its lights suggesting rather than depicting the urban fabric, the whole becoming a field of punctuated luminosity against the uniform dark of surrounding plain. The third terrace delivers you to a zone of transitional perception, where enough light remains in the western sky to outline the ziggurate's mass against its afterglow, where the distinction between built structure and natural horizon still maintains itself in visual consciousness. You rest again, longer now, allowing the tremor in your thighs to subside, drinking from the water skin you carry and finding the liquid unexpectedly cold, as though it too has participated in the elevation, has absorbed something of the upper atmosphere's chill. The second terrace seems vast after the progressive constriction of higher levels, its platform extending in all directions with a generosity that approaches the spatial experience of ground itself. Yet you remain elevated, still above the general level of surrounding construction, still possessed of a prospect that distinguishes your position from ordinary urban circulation. You approach the first terrace, the original platform that blocks half the sky, from the perspective of those who stand at the base. From above, its extension seems almost excessive, a prodigality of foundation that the diminishing upper stories only gradually justify. The ramp's final turns coil upon themselves with geometric compression, delivering you to the portal where your ascent began, now transformed by darkness and direction into an exit rather than entrance. The courtyard of Esagilla lies before you, its eternal flame still visible across the intervening space, its single acolyte perhaps changed by shift, but its continuous burning uninterrupted by your departure and return. You walk toward it with the unsteady gait of one recently descended from height, your body still adjusting to the horizontal plane, to the equality of all directions that characterizes ground-level movement. The processional way awaits your tomorrow, its glazed beasts patient in their permanent guarding, its inscriptions still proclaiming what Nebuchadnezzar proclaimed, what all such proclamations aspire toward: continuity, permanence, the defeat of time through the material persistence of monumental statement. Today only foundations remain, appearing as a dark square 90 meters per side in satellite imagery, and the future technology of that observation implies a perspective even more removed than your own aerial vantage, a view from orbit that reduces the entire plane to map, to data, to the colored tiles that your own vertigo briefly imposed. You reach the courtyard's center, turn to look back at what you have descended. Etemenanki. The name persists, the structure persists in your immediate memory, if not in the full material presence that obtained at the century of its completion. The ziggurate was traditionally associated with Marduk by the 6th century BCE, and for ancient Mesopotamians, dedication implied a commitment that outlasted the physical structure, transferring significance from perishable construction to renewable ritual. The cold air moves across your face with the gentleness of evening's deepened phase. The wind that harassed your upper descent now subsided to mere breath, mere indication of atmospheric movement without force or direction. Around you, Babylon prepares for sleep, the city that never truly sleeps entering that mode of reduced activity that passes for rest in the continuous operation of urban existence. You will carry this climb within you, the spiral of ascent and descent inscribed in muscle memory, in the proprioceptive knowledge of what it means to approach the sky and to return from that approach, to touch the foundation of heaven and earth, and to acknowledge that touching is not holding, that approach is not arrival, that the house built for divine visitation remains ultimately human in its construction and in its inevitable, patient, persistent ruin. The stairway begins where the last terrace wall meets the southern flank of the palace complex, and you are climbing it now. Each step is baked brick, slightly concave at the center where generations of sandaled feet have worn the surface into gentle hollows. The morning air is still cool, though the sun has cleared the eastern ramparts of the lower city, and you feel that coolness moving across your forearms as you ascend. Around you, the ochre walls rise in measured courses, each level set back from the one below so that the terraces above seem to float against the pale sky. The particular green of irrigated plants against ochre brick and pale sky surrounds you on every side now, a color you will remember without naming. Diodorus Siculus wrote of these gardens, and Strabo wrote of them too. They are first attested in Greek sources, who described what they had heard from travelers claiming to have seen the terraced slopes rising beside the Euphrates. No definitive archaeological location has been identified within Babylon, though many have searched for foundations that might confirm the written accounts. You continue upward, and the walls enclose you more completely now, creating corridors of shade and sudden openings where the light falls in rectangular pools across your path. The scent of orange blossom heavy in enclosed air reaches you before you see the trees themselves, a sweetness so dense it seems almost solid, pressing gently against your temples as you walk. Bitter orange trees appear first, their dark leaves glossy with recent watering, arranged in ordered rows that follow the curve of the terrace. You are ascending a palace terrace, planted with ordered rows of bitter orange and pomegranate, and the symmetry of the planting becomes more apparent with each step. The gardeners have pruned these trees to a uniform height, perhaps 12 cubits, so that their crowns form a continuous ceiling of foliage when you stand between the rows. Beneath your feet, the brick paving gives way to a finer surface, baked tiles set in a herringbone pattern that directs water toward concealed drains. Water trickles through concealed channels, a constant murmur beneath the louder sound of your own breathing and the distant, rhythmic calling of laborers somewhere above. The pomegranate trees begin where the oranges end, their fruit still small and hard, gleaming like polished stones among the narrow leaves. You pause between two of these trees, and the particular green of irrigated plants against ochre brick and pale sky frames your view of the lower city spreading eastward toward the river. The Euphrates moves through its course like a strand of bronze wire in the morning light, and beyond it, the flat plain extends to a horizon where the sky presses down with the weight of accumulated heat. Coolness rises from damp soil, perceptible 3 steps before entering tree shade, and you step forward into that coolness now, feeling it settle against your skin like a familiar garment. Some scholars associate the gardens with Nineveh rather than Babylon, confusing Assyrian and Babylonian achievements in the manner that distant observers often confuse neighboring kingdoms. The Assyrians too built terraces, and their kings boasted of gardens watered by engineered streams, and the Greek writers who preserved these memories may have transferred what they knew of Nineveh to the more famous name of Babylon. You move through the pomegranate grove, and the fruit's faint astringency mingles with the heavier sweetness of the orange blossom behind you. A lizard, no longer than your thumb, darts from a crack in the retaining wall and vanishes into the shadow of an irrigation channel. The wall itself is constructed of mud brick, faced with baked brick where the water might erode the softer core, and you place your palm against its surface to feel the residual chill of night stored within the mass. The Greek term kremastos can mean overhanging as well as hanging, suggesting terraced construction rather than the suspended gardens that later imagination preferred. The terraces overhang each other in stepped succession, each projecting slightly beyond the one below, so that from a distance the whole structure appears to emerge from the palace walls like a green waterfall arrested in its descent. You continue climbing, and the stairway narrows, turning back upon itself in a series of landings where stone basins catch overflow from the irrigation system above. In one of these basins, pink water lilies float among their own round leaves, their flowers barely open in the morning coolness. The scent of orange blossom heavy in enclosed air lingers here, trapped by the surrounding walls, and you breathe it in slowly, feeling the expansion of your ribs against the loose fabric of your tunic. If they existed in Babylon, the gardens would have required an elaborate irrigation system, lifting water from the Euphrates to the highest level, a feat of engineering that would have demanded constant maintenance and the coordinated labor of many hands. You hear that labor now, before you see it, a rhythmic clanking that resolves into the operation of a chain pump as you round the final corner of this terrace level. Slaves are operating a chain pump lifting Euphrates water to the highest level, their bodies moving in the synchronized pattern of long practice. The device consists of an endless chain carrying clay vessels that dip into a cistern at the bottom and discharge into a trough at the top, and the men who drive it walk in a circle, pushing wooden bars that turn the mechanism. Their skin gleams with sweat and the water that splashes from imperfectly sealed joints, and their bare feet have worn a circular track in the brick paving, a groove you notice as you pass close enough to feel the spray against your ankle. The water they lift travels through ceramic pipes set into the terrace walls, emerging at regular intervals into the planting beds above. You observe the slaves operating the chain pump for a moment longer, noting the economy of their movements, the way each man adjusts his pace to maintain the steady rotation that the mechanism demands. One of them glances toward you without breaking stride, his eyes meeting yours with an expression you cannot read before returning to the immediate circle of his labor. Archaeological excavations at Babylon have not revealed structures matching the classical descriptions, though the city has been explored systematically for more than a century of modern scholarship. The German expedition led by Robert Coldewey uncovered the Processional Way and the Ishtar Gate, the foundations of the ziggurat Etemenanki, the palace complexes of Nebuchadnezzar's city, yet no terraced garden emerged from their careful documentation. You walk now along a covered gallery where the brick vaulting is pierced by small windows, each framing a segment of the landscape below or the sky above, and the alternating light and shadow creates a rhythm in your step that matches your slowed breathing. Water trickles through concealed channels, a constant murmur that follows you through this passage, sourceless and everywhere, as if the structure itself exhales moisture. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions describe extensive palace gardens, but not the specifically terraced hanging gardens that the Greek sources celebrated. The king boasted of his building works in the standard formulae of Babylonian royal rhetoric, the fortified walls and the temple restorations and the palace expansions, and he mentioned gardens in connection with his pleasure houses. Yet the distinctive feature that made these gardens famous in later tradition finds no confirmation in the contemporary cuneiform record. You emerge from the gallery into a broader terrace where the planting changes character, becoming less formal, more suggestive of a managed wilderness designed to evoke the mountain landscapes of foreign lands. The tradition that they were built for a Median queen homesick for mountain landscapes appears only in later sources, compiled centuries after the Neo-Babylonian dynasty had passed into the administration of Persian satraps and Macedonian generals. Cedars rise here, their branches spreading wide enough to shade a small gathering, and you move toward the largest of these trees, its trunk wrapped in a lattice of rope where climbers have trained some lighter vine. The bark is rough under your fingertips, deeply furrowed in the manner of trees that grow slowly in their native mountains and suffer transplantation to hotter, drier climates. You are sitting in the shade of a transplanted cedar as the city noise rises from below like heat shimmer, a continuous low murmur of commerce and movement that reaches you attenuated by distance, stripped of individual voices so that it becomes a texture rather than a message. Now, seated against the trunk with your legs extended along the brick border of its planting bed, you feel that coolness settling into your bones with the patience of water finding its level. The city noise continues, rising and falling in waves that correspond perhaps to the passage of processions or the opening and closing of market gates, perhaps merely to the statistical fluctuation of thousands of individual activities. You do not need to distinguish the causes. The cedar's needles filter the sunlight into a green-tinted shade that makes your hands appear unfamiliar, belonging to someone who has spent his life in forests rather than in the exposed brightness of Mesopotamian plains. Terrace gardening was practiced in ancient Mesopotamia using mud brick retaining walls, a technique developed independently in many hilly regions, yet refined here to an extraordinary degree by the concentration of royal resources. The walls that support each level must resist the lateral pressure of saturated soil, the expansion and contraction of seasonal wetting and drying, the gradual decomposition of organic matter within the planting medium. You trace with your eye the line of the nearest retaining wall, following its course as it steps down in regular increments toward the palace complex below, each level planted with vegetation appropriate to its exposure and drainage. Date palms, pomegranates, cedars, and flowering shrubs are attested in palace garden contexts, the botanical repertoire of elite horticulture in this region, and you can identify most of these categories in the vegetation that surrounds your present position. A gardener approaches along the path that skirts the cedar grove, carrying a bronze blade and a basket of trimmings. He does not acknowledge you, absorbed in the inspection of each plant he passes, and you watch his progress with the detached attention of one who has temporarily surrendered the initiative of movement. He stops at a miniature date palm some 20 cubits from where you sit, and you find yourself watching a gardener trim a miniature date palm, tool marks precise as cuneiform, each cut deliberate and final. The palm has been trained to a height of perhaps 4 cubits, its fronds reduced to a symmetrical crown that echoes the shape of full-sized specimens in the lower orchards. The gardener removes a yellowing lower frond, then another, his body positioned always to allow the clean stroke that will not damage the central bud. The severed leaves fall into his basket with a sound like heavy fabric being folded. The precision of his work suggests training that began in childhood, the transmission of skill through imitation and correction until the movements become automatic, available without conscious deliberation. You consider the analogy to writing, to the formation of cuneiform signs by stylus pressed into clay, the wedge-shaped impressions arrayed in patterns that carry meaning through their arrangement. The gardener's tool marks precise as cuneiform encode a different kind of information, the optimal structure for a plant's continued growth and productivity, yet both systems depend upon the disciplined hand and the observing eye. He moves to another palm, and another, his progress creating a wake of trimmed symmetry through the grove. The scent of orange blossom heavy in enclosed air has faded here, replaced by the sharper green smell of fresh-cut vegetation and the deeper resinous note of the cedar itself. The gardens were listed as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world by Hellenistic writers, compilers of marvels who sought to catalogue the supreme achievements of human and divine craftsmanship across the territories that Alexander's conquests had made mutually visible. The list shifted in its particulars across centuries of transmission, yet the Babylonian gardens persisted, perhaps because they represented something beyond mere scale or wealth, an aspiration toward the reconciliation of nature and architecture, of the fertile earth and the constructed elevation. You remain seated against the cedar trunk, and the particular green of irrigated plants against ochre brick and pale sky has begun to shift toward the amber tones of afternoon, the light angling more steeply through the branches so that shadows lengthen and pool in the spaces between planting beds. Water trickles through concealed channels, a constant murmur that seems louder now in the relative quiet of the upper terraces, the laborers at the chain pump having been relieved or having completed their assigned hours. You imagine the water's path, lifted from the river, distributed through the hydraulic network, finally reaching these highest levels to sustain vegetation that could not survive on rainfall alone. The system requires continuous attention, the clearing of silt, the repair of cracked pipes, the adjustment of flow rates to match the seasonal needs of different plantings. Without this maintenance, the gardens would revert within months to the dust and desolation of their natural setting, the terraces becoming platforms for wind-borne seeds and ephemeral weeds, until the retaining walls themselves succumb to the pressure of unrestrained erosion. Cuneiform texts describe royal orchards and parks as symbols of kingly power and cosmic order, the cultivated space asserting human capacity to organize and beautify the chaotic wilderness that surrounded the Mesopotamian cities. The garden was a microcosm, its ordered plantings reflecting the harmonious arrangement of the cosmos under divine supervision, its irrigation recalling the mythic rivers that flowed from the abode of the gods to sustain creation. You understand this symbolism abstractly, yet your present experience is more immediate, the physical sensations of shade and scent, and the play of light through leaves constituting a language older than any theological interpretation. The cedar trunk against your spine transmits its slow vibration, the tree's response to wind currents you cannot directly perceive, a communication in frequencies below hearing. The gardener has moved out of sight, his basket presumably fuller, his circuit of the grove complete for this day's attention. You rise from your position, feeling the slight stiffness of muscles held too long in one posture, and resume your movement along the terrace path. The descent will be different from the ascent, as all descents are, gravity now assisting where it previously resisted, yet the same sequence of levels presenting themselves in reverse order, familiar yet strangely altered by the changed perspective. You are descending through cooling levels of vegetation as evening approaches, and the light has shifted definitively toward the westering angle, the shadows extending eastward in elongated forms that distort the geometry of the planting. The pomegranate grove appears below you, the fruit trees now in shadow, while their upper branches still catch the last illumination, creating a two-toned effect that will resolve into uniform darkness within the quarter hour. The chain pump has stopped, or perhaps you have taken a different path that avoids the cistern where the laborers work. The rhythmic sound that accompanied your ascent is absent, replaced by the individual noises of birds settling for the night, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth of the lower terraces, the distant continuation of city life that persists regardless of the sun's position. You follow the sound downward, using it as orientation in the fading light, your feet finding the worn centers of the brick steps without requiring visual confirmation. The bitter orange trees emerge from shadow as you reach the level where some western exposure still admits light, their glossy leaves catching the last horizontal rays so that each tree seems briefly self-illuminated, a green lantern against the darkening walls. You pause among these trees, and the particular green of irrigated plants against ochre brick and pale sky has become merely a memory, the actual colors now submerged in the blue-gray uniformity of twilight that reduces all distinctions to value without hue. The stairway continues downward, and you follow it, each step releasing the tension of ascent that had accumulated in your calves and thighs, the descent becoming almost automatic as the rhythm establishes itself. The lower city awaits. It sounds more distinct now, individual voices separating from the general murmur as the competing noises of day diminish. You carry with you the impression of the terraces, their ordered vegetation and hidden waters, their suspension between earth and sky that gave them their lasting fame and their enduring mystery. No definitive archaeological location has been identified within Babylon, yet you have walked where they might have been, where something like them certainly existed in the imagination of those who built and tended the gardens of the palace complex. whether these were the specific terraces that Diodorus Siculus described, or other constructions that shared their essential character. The final level opens onto the broader precincts of the palace, the administrative buildings where scribes work late into the evening by lamplight, recording the transactions of empire in the wedge-shaped signs that preserve so much and so little of what was thought and done. You pass through this zone without entering, the gardens having ended, the cultivated giving way to the paved, the natural to the architectural. Yet the gardens persist in your awareness, their sensory qualities retained in a form that will not submit to the precision of description, existing instead as a mood, a climate of attention, a readiness to perceive the particular green of irrigated plants against ochre brick and pale sky, should it ever appear again in some other context, some other life, some other dream of ascending and descending through levels of constructed nature toward the foundation of heaven and earth. The gate that leads outward stands open, unguarded at this hour, and you move through it into the streets that will take you back to the river, to the ordinary sustenance and rest that await those who are not kings or queens, not builders of wonders, merely witnesses to the patient accumulation of human striving and its equally patient dissolution. The coolness of evening has settled over the lower city, and you feel it against your face as you walk, a sensation that connects you to the damp soil of the terraces above, to the slaves whose labor maintained the impossible gardens, to the Greek writers who preserved the memory of what they had never seen, to the archaeologists who sought what may never have existed in the form that searching imagined. The street slopes gently downward, and you follow it, the river's presence announced by the increased density of habitation, the concentration of trade and travel that has always clustered near the water's edge in this city between the streams. You are standing at the threshold of a broad courtyard in the temple precinct, where the morning light falls in long rectangles across the baked brick floor. The Euphrates lies somewhere beyond the walls, its presence announced by the damp coolness that lingers in the shaded corridors even as the day warms. Around you, merchants unload cargoes of raw clay from reed boats moored at the nearby quay, and porters carry their burdens in woven baskets toward the workshops where the day's work of inscription will begin. The year is somewhere in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, when Babylon's power stretches from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, when the city between the streams has become the greatest center of learning and record-keeping the world has known. Cuneiform writing has been practiced in Mesopotamia since approximately 3200 BCE, and the traditions you are about to witness represent more than 2 millennia of accumulated knowledge, refined through countless generations of patient instruction. The grit of unwashed clay between fingers smells of river silt, that particular mineral tang that clings to everything in this city, built upon mud and ambition. You move through an archway framed with glazed bricks in blue and gold, the images of striding lions watching with eternal patience as mortals pass beneath their gaze. Water stands in shallow pools where the clay has been left to soak, and the sunlight fractures across these surfaces into trembling fragments of white and amber. Somewhere a pigeon bursts upward in a clatter of wings, its shadow racing across the warm plaster before vanishing into the brightness overhead. The courtyard opens before you like the palm of an offered hand, and you accept its invitation with slow steps across the uneven paving. Inside the school, the chorus of students repeating signs, aloud rises and falls in patterns older than any living memory. You are standing among the junior pupils now, boys who have perhaps begun their training at 8 or 9 years of age, though some started younger if their fathers were already scribes in the service of temple or palace. Their voices overlap in deliberate unison, each syllable shaped with the particular care that the language demands, the Sumerian compositions rolling from tongues that will never speak that tongue in any marketplace or domestic chamber. For Sumerian was a dead language by this period, preserved only in the liturgical and literary texts that formed the backbone of the Scribble curriculum, its grammar mastered through repetition rather than living conversation. The oldest known writing system, proto-cuneiform, emerged in the late Uruk period, and the wedge-shaped impressions these students practice bear direct lineage to those earliest experiments in permanent communication. Sharp scratch of reed stylus on soft tablet, then muffled as clay firms beneath the pressure of deliberate hand. You watch a boy of perhaps 12 summers pressing his sign into the yielding surface, the vertical stroke followed by the characteristic horizontal wedge that gives cuneiform its name, the Latin word for wedge applied by scholars who would not live for 2,000 years yet. His tablet is small enough to cup in both palms, the kind used for elementary exercises, and the dampness of its preparation still darkens its surface where the recent impressions glisten. A master passes between the rows of seated students, his own tablet tucked beneath his arm bearing the model text from which the pupils copy, and you follow his progress with quiet attention. The room smells of wet earth and the oil lamps that burn even in daylight, their smoke rising toward the high windows where the sky appears in narrow strips of intense blue. The master stops beside a student whose work has displeased him, and you draw near enough to observe the correction. You perceive the economy of material that governs all scribble practice, the waste of good clay avoided whenever possible. The blade is thin and slightly curved, its edge catching the lamplight as it moves across the surface in controlled arcs, lifting the mistaken wedges and leaving shallow scars that will be smoothed with damp cloth and thumb. The boy holds his tablet steady with both hands, his eyes lowered in the discipline of acceptance that the training instills. Bronze gleams against terracotta brown, and the scraped fragments fall in fine dust upon the reed matting that covers the floor. The master does not speak during this operation, his silence more eloquent than any rebuke, and when the surface has been restored to workable smoothness, he turns without word to continue his patrol among the benches. Warmth of sun-heated drying tablets, slightly curved as they shrink, draws you now toward the outer court where the completed exercises are arranged in patient ranks. The mathematics of their placement follows no rule you can discern, yet some ancient principle of order governs their spacing, perhaps merely the practical need for air to circulate between them as moisture departs. These tablets will never be fired, most of them, destined instead for the recycling pool where failed exercises return to anonymous mud. But among them, you perceive, lie works of greater ambition, the corners of their surfaces already inscribed with identifying marks that will survive the kiln's transformation. Mathematical texts demonstrate advanced arithmetic, algebra, and geometric calculation, and somewhere in this collection, a senior student has perhaps copied the tablet of reciprocals, that essential tool for division in a system based on 60 rather than 10, or worked through the procedures for calculating the dimensions of temples and ziggurates. Ink-black soot from the baking kiln drifts across the courtyard at evening firing, and you turn toward that source of disturbance in the otherwise tranquil afternoon. The kiln itself squats against the northern wall, its mouth dark and hungry, the apprentices feeding it with bundles of dried reeds and cakes of dung fuel. The heat reaches you across 20 cubits of paved ground, a dry embrace that makes the river dampness of morning seem belonging to another season entirely. An older man directs the operation with minimal gesture, his authority established by decades of successful firings, the knowledge of temperature and timing that no text can fully transmit. You observe the careful transfer now, the leather-hard pieces lifted with flat paddles and stacked in the chamber's interior with spaces between them for the fire's circulation. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, though this harbor serves clay rather than vessels, the quay where the raw material arrives from the riverbank deposits upstream. The preparation of clay unfolds before you in stages that mirror the scribble training itself, a sequence of repetitions leading toward mastery. Men knead the gathered earth with feet and hands, working out the stones and organic fragments that would floor a finished tablet, adding water in measured quantities until the consistency satisfies experienced touch. The shaped loaves rest under damp covering, awaiting the call of workshop or school, and you perceive how this humble substance supports the entire intellectual enterprise of the civilization. Clay was the primary medium, but waxed wooden boards and leather scrolls were also used, particularly for documents requiring portability or temporary status, the perishable nature of these alternatives ensuring that only the most durable records survived for future discovery. The cold air moves across your face as evening approaches, the temperature dropping swiftly in this climate of extreme daily variation. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes for the last time today, and the porters stack empty baskets in leaning towers against the warehouse walls. Somewhere a dog barks once, then submits to the settling darkness, and the first stars emerge in that portion of sky visible above the courtyard's enclosing structures. The astronomical diaries recorded celestial observations in systematic fashion, and you imagine the night watches of specialized scribes who would note the positions of planets, the timings of eclipses, the appearances of comets and meteors, all entered in the same wedge-shaped script upon tablets that would eventually find their way to temple archives. These observations served both religious and practical purposes. The omens read from celestial events guiding royal decision, the accumulated data permitting ever more precise prediction of recurrent phenomena. By the Neo-Babylonian period, cuneiform was used alongside Aramaic alphabetic script on perishable materials, the newer system spreading through the practical domains of commerce and administration, while the older preserved its prestige in scholarship and cult. You move through corridors where both forms of writing coexist on different surfaces, the Aramaic ink strokes flowing where cuneiform wedges would require more laborious impression. The contrast speaks of a culture in transition, though the transition would extend across centuries rather than decades, the old script retaining its authority long after its practical disadvantages became apparent. Legal documents, letters, and administrative records comprise the bulk of surviving tablets, and you glimpse stacks of such materials in the chambers you pass. The routine documentation of property transfers, debt obligations, marriage arrangements, temple offerings, all preserved in their thousands where papyrus and parchment dissolved into archaeological absence. The sharp scratch of Reed's stylus returns to your attention as you enter a smaller chamber where a single scribe works in concentrated solitude. He is perhaps 40 years of age, his beard trimmed in the fashion of professional men, his garment the simple skirt that distinguishes the literate from the elaborately robed administrators he serves. Before him lies a large tablet, its surface ruled with lines that guide his work, and you recognize from his deliberate pace that this is no routine copy but original composition. Nebuchadnezzar's building inscriptions were composed by royal scribes in elaborate hymnic style, and this may be such a work, the king's name appearing in the second line with the honorific titles that accumulate through reign and conquest. The scribe pauses between phrases, his stylus lifted while he consults some inner reservoir of formulae, then descends again to impress the next sequence of signs with unhurried precision. Tablet collections in temples served as reference libraries for ritual and scholarly purpose, and you find yourself now in the heart of such an archive, the storage chamber where finished works accumulate across generations of donation and dedicated copying. The shelves rise toward darkness, each level packed with tablets arranged according to principles of organization that the attending priest explains in low tones. Some are grouped by subject, others by provenance, still others by the deity in whose service they were composed or consulted. The attendant lifts a tablet at random, its surface covered with the dense script of medical prescriptions, symptoms matched to remedies in patterns that modern science would partially confirm and partially dismiss. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh provides the most famous parallel, though that collection would be scattered and buried before eventual recovery, its fragments now distributed across museums in London and Baghdad, and wherever Assyriology established its academic foothold. Scribble families passed down their profession across generations, and the attendant speaks of his own lineage without pride or emphasis, merely stating fact as one states the season or the phase of moon. His grandfather taught his father taught him, and the sons he has trained will teach their sons in turn if the craft persists. You consider the fragility of such transmission, the wars and plagues and political upheavals that could sever a chain of knowledge in a single generation. Yet here it continues, sustained by the persistent need for records and the social prestige that literacy conferred. The cylinder seal remained the primary instrument for authenticating documents, and the attendant produces his own from a cord at his waist, its carved surface showing the figure of a minor deity interceding before a greater, the scene impressed upon clay to validate contracts and letters with personal identification more secure than any signature. You are standing at the harbor at dawn once more, though days have passed in your passage through this institution, the cycle of observation and rest blurring into continuous present. The preparation of clay continues unchanged, the kneading, shaping, smoothing performed by hands that differ only in individual variation from those you watched before. A woman joins this operation, her presence unusual enough to mark her as belonging to a family of scribes, perhaps widow or daughter exercising prerogative in the absence of male relatives. She works with the same expertise as her companions, the same knowledge of texture and moisture encoded in muscle memory rather than conscious thought. The careful impress of stylus into yielding surface, each wedge distinct in angle and depth, awaits the prepared tablets in the school beyond, and you follow their path through the now familiar archway with its patient lions. A student passes carrying a basket of recycled material, the failed exercises and broken tablets destined for resoaking and reworking, the written word returning to potential in endless cycle. Nothing is wasted in this economy, neither material nor effort, the investment of training protected by systems of conservation that developed alongside the technology itself. Thousands of unpublished tablets from Babylon remain in museum storerooms, and you imagine these future discoveries waiting in darkness, the accumulated documentation of daily life that scholars will eventually read with painstaking slowness, each sign deciphered against the accumulated knowledge of 2 centuries of Assyriological labor. A senior student arranges his compositions with the confidence of approaching mastery, their surfaces bearing the complex patterns of literary Sumerian that only the most advanced curriculum demands. You listen as he reads aloud in the cadences of a tongue no longer spoken, except in these ritual recitations, the grammar learned through imitation rather than intuitive acquisition. His voice carries the slight hesitation of constructed performance, each case ending carefully weighed against the paradigms memorized in earlier years, yet the overall effect achieves something beyond mere competence, approaching the musicality that the texts demand. The cold air moves across your face as clouds pass before the sun, momentary shadow bringing momentary chill in the courtyard's open exposure. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargo still, the supply of raw material endless as the river itself, the demand for written records equally inexhaustible in a state that governed through documentation. You observe a group of younger students at their elementary exercises, the repetitive wedges that form the simplest signs pressed into soft clay with the concentration that their age makes possible, the capacity for patient repetition that adulthood would erode. These children are participating in continuity that reaches back to the first experiments in permanent symbolic communication, the transition from temporary counting, tokens to inscribed records that transformed human cognition and social organization. The kiln master opens the chamber with practiced caution, the residual heat emerging in visible shimmer, the transformed tablets lifted out with long-handled tools onto cooling racks where they will rest for hours before handling. The sound of ceramic contact, that particular chime of fired clay against fired clay, replaces the softer noises of the working day, and you perceive the permanence that has been achieved, the resistance to time and water that distinguishes these objects from the perishable alternatives of wood and leather and papyrus. The tablets you watch being born will survive, some of them, until that distant future when their excavation will astonish and puzzle those who find them, the script forgotten, the language dead, yet the information recoverable through scholarly ingenuity. You are standing in the archive once more, the long chamber where the finished products of countless scribble careers await consultation or mere preservation. The attendant has kindled additional lamps against the advancing dusk, their flames straight in the still air, their smoke rising to join the soot-darkened ceiling. He searches for a particular tablet requested by a priest preparing tomorrow's ritual, his fingers reading the edge markings that identify contents without requiring the withdrawal of each piece from its place. He locates one such record, its surface covered with the tiny script of nightly notation, the positions of moon and planets measured against reference stars, the weather conditions that affected visibility, frankly admitted where other cultures might have concealed such impediments to perfect observation. The sharp scratch of reed stylus sounds from an adjacent chamber where work continues despite the hour, the dedication of serious students, or the deadline pressure of administrative necessity. You move toward this sound through connecting doorways, the spaces between archives and workshops permeable in the temple's functional layout. A man works alone, his lamp supplemented by a window's fading twilight, copying what appears to be a mathematical procedure text, the steps for solving some class of problems laid out with pedagogical clarity. You recognize in his careful progression the same logical structure that would reappear in Greek mathematics a millennium hence, the same methods translated into different notational systems, the same problems posed and solved according to principles that transcend any particular formulation. You observe this coexistence of scripts in the correspondence that awaits dispatch on a nearby table, the cuneiform draft perhaps serving as backup for the Aramaic original that will actually travel. The dual system reflects Babylon's position at the intersection of trade routes and imperial administration, the need to communicate with Aramaic-speaking populations throughout the Near East. The proportion of practical materials in this working archive confirms what excavation has revealed elsewhere, the literary and scholarly texts preserved only by selective retention or fortunate accident of burial. The preparation of clay begins again, the kneading, shaping, smoothing performed by the same individuals or their substitutes in generational succession. A new load of raw material has arrived from upriver, its quality tested by experienced fingers before acceptance. The rejected portions return to the boat for downstream disposal. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes with the efficiency of long practice, the baskets emptied and stacked, the accounting of delivery made in the office nearby where a scribe records weights and measures against the names of suppliers. You imagine this clerk's sons perhaps continuing his craft, or rising to more prestigious forms of the same activity, the palace service or temple scholarship that represented the summit of scribble ambition. You observe the cylinder seal's use now, the impression rolled across the damp clay that seals a storage jar, the identity of responsible official permanently fixed in miniature sculpture. You walk among them without touching, respecting the vulnerability of their unfinished state, the ease with which an accidental pressure might mar a surface that will become permanent after firing. You consider how many of these routine documents will eventually find repository in temple collections, how many will be recycled or broken or simply lost in the accumulation of material that outgrows available space. The proportion of known to unknown, of published to unpublished, of preserved to destroyed, suggests the immensity of what has vanished and the fragility of what survives. The kiln fires for the final time in your observation, the soot drifting in familiar plume. You watch the removal of finished tablets, their transformation complete, their survival now dependent on historical fortune rather than technical process. The scribble school empties gradually, students departing to homes scattered through the city's dense habitation, their exercises carried with them or left for tomorrow's continuation. The master scribe remains in his chamber, reviewing the day's productions or preparing tomorrow's models, the endless cycle of instruction and practice maintaining cuneiform against the erosion of time and changing circumstance. You move toward the river, the street that leads from temple precinct to waterside, following the gentle slope that characterizes this terrain between the streams. The sound of the current reaches you before the sight, that particular rush and murmur of water moving through a landscape it has shaped across geological ages. Here the boats are moored for the night, their crews settled in temporary quarters or sleeping aboard, the commerce suspended until dawn restores the possibilities of movement and exchange. You imagine the first experimenters scratching their signs into clay somewhere along these waterways, the innovation spreading through the networks of trade and administration that connected the cities of the plain, the permanence of their invention ensured by the very material they chose, the durability of fired clay against the perishability of all alternatives. The stars emerge in fullness now, the astronomical observations that some scribe will record already proceeding in their eternal patterns above the city. You stand at the water's edge where the mud gives way to liquid darkness, the boundary between solid and fluid as ambiguous here as the boundary between past and present in your experience of this place. The scribble tradition you have observed will continue for centuries yet, will survive the Persian conquest and the Greek and the Parthian, will persist in reduced form even under Roman shadow, before finally fading into the silence from which modern scholarship has partially recovered it. Clay and reed, stylus and tablet, the fundamental technologies of this civilization's intellectual life, will persist as well, transformed but recognizable, the wedge-shaped impressions giving way to other forms, yet serving the same ultimate purpose, the preservation of human thought against the dissolving force of time and memory. The river moves past, carrying its burden of silt toward the delta and the sea, the same silt that will become the clay of future tablets, the same water that will moisten it for shaping. You turn from this prospect toward the city that spreads inland, its towers and ziggurates dimly visible against the star-scattered sky, its inhabitants moving through evening routines that have changed little across the generations you have witnessed. Somewhere a dog barks, then stillness returns, broken only by the eternal murmur of water and the occasional voice of night watch or sleepless citizen. The chapter of observation closes, the chapter of rest begins, and you follow the street that slopes gently upward toward whatever shelter awaits, the river's presence still audible behind you, still announcing itself in the density of habitation and the persistence of trade that has always clustered near the water's edge in this city between the streams. You are climbing the narrow stair that winds upward through the temple wall, your palm flat against baked brick, still holding the day's warmth. The passage turns twice before opening onto the roof, where 3 astronomers already kneel among their instruments, oil lamps flickering in glass shields. The year is somewhere in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, though the exact count matters less than the position of stars above Babylon tonight. You feel the weight of accumulated tradition in the careful movements of these men who trace patterns their grandfathers taught them to recognize. The roof tiles radiate faintly against your back as you settle at the parapet's edge. Eastward, the plain stretches dark toward invisible hills, while westward, the last bronze stain of sunset clings to the horizon where the Euphrates bends southward. The particular clarity of desert air reveals stars appearing one by one without twilight lingering, each point emerging fully formed rather than struggling through haze. A scribe younger than the others arranges his wax tablet, stylus poised, waiting for the senior observer to speak the first measurement of evening. You smell dust and dried reeds and something sharper, mint from a crushed sprig someone chewed to stay awake, perhaps the youth whose eyes keep drifting to the growing darkness overhead. The chief astronomer, a man named Beluzar if memory serves from the courtyard below, lifts a wooden sighting tube to his right eye. He speaks a single word that carries across the flat roof, asterisk, evening. Asterisk, the stylus scratches. They have begun. This night will join thousands like it in clay libraries beneath the temple, preserved against time's erosion by the very dryness that makes your throat ache now. You watch Beluzar rotate his instrument slowly, tracking some invisible line between reference points known only to initiates of this discipline. The Babylonians distinguished between fixed stars and wandering stars, planets, and his search tonight concerns one of the wanderers whose irregular path demanded centuries of patient notation before prediction became possible. Hours pass in near silence, broken only by whispered coordinates and the scratch of stylus against prepared surfaces. The metallic taste of exhaustion arrives at the hour when the body's rhythm demands sleep, yet none of the astronomers yield to it. You observe how they divide the sky into regions marked by familiar constellations. The Scorpion rising now in the southeast, the Lion descending westward, the Twins standing vertical above the northern gate. Observation texts record precise positions relative to reference stars and constellations, and Beluzar murmurs numbers that locate his target among the fixed patterns. Another man, older, wrapped in wool despite the mild air, confirms the reading with his own instrument, a bronze ring marked with tiny wedges of cuneiform. The first appearance of Venus as evening star draws a longer utterance from Beluzar, a formula you half catch, asterisk, Ishtar in her evening manifestation, in the path of the gods, above the Scorpion's heart. Asterisk Ishtar, the planet's deity name, echoes in your mind as the scribe records. The planets were associated with specific deities: Marduk for Jupiter, Ishtar for Venus, Nergal for Mars, Ninurta for Saturn, Nabu for Mercury. Each wandering light carried divine correspondence that made astronomical observation inseparable from religious duty. Astronomers served both religious and practical functions, timing rituals and predicting omens, and you understand now why these men pray briefly before each significant measurement, small gestures of thumb to lip and whispered invocation. Between observations, the astronomers speak of ordinary things. Someone mentions bread purchased at an unfavorable price. Another complains of his daughter's cough. The mundane weaves through the sublime without tension, as if the sky's grandeur required no special vocabulary, no elevated tone. You find yourself breathing more slowly, matching the unhurried pace of their movements. Zodiac was formalized into 12 equal signs during the Neo-Babylonian or early Persian period, and though the equal division remains incomplete in this era, the recognizable band of the god's path already circles overhead, its sections named for animals and heroes of old stories. A meteor streaks across the bull of heaven, dismissed as omen-worthy but not planet-related. The flash lasts less than a heartbeat, Yet all pause mark the moment. Note the quadrant. Beluzar speaks a brief phrase to the scribe, who records it separately from the running diary of Venus. Eclipses were recorded and predicted using period relations, such as the Saros cycle, but meteors belong to different categories of celestial event, less tractable to mathematical ordering. The older astronomer mutters something about fire from the gods, whether blessing or warning he does not specify. You watch where the streak faded, finding nothing now but steady stars in the bull's shoulder. The cold deepens toward midnight, and observers wrap themselves in wool cloaks as Mars clears the horizon. Nergal, the red planet, the warrior god, ascends in his own time regardless of human schedules. His ruddy light distinguishes him immediately from the pure white of Venus, the steadier gold of Saturn already high in the south. Beluzar seems to anticipate Nergal's arrival, his instrument already oriented before the planet fully clears the distant palms. The scribe prepares a fresh tablet, for Mars demands its own series of measurements, its own sequence of timed observations through the remaining hours. You shift against the parapet, finding new angles for your back where the residual warmth persists longest. The mint smell has faded, replaced by lamp oil and the faint iron of the bronze instruments cooling in changing air. Somewhere below a door closes, voices rise and subside in the temple courtyard. The astronomers ignore these terrestrial interruptions, trained to concentration that spans generations. You sense the ghost presences of dead observers in each confident gesture, each inherited method of holding the sighting tube steady against one's cheekbone. Beluzar calls for water, and a servant brings it in a glazed cup that catches starlight. He drinks without looking away from his work, tilting the vessel by touch alone. The Enuma Anu Enlil compendium organized celestial omens into 70 tablets, and you imagine those tablets stored somewhere beneath your feet, accumulated wisdom of skies, watched on nights like this stretching backward beyond memory. The compendium's very bulk suggests the overwhelming abundance of phenomena requiring interpretation. Lunar halos, solar coronae, colors of sunrise, directions of cometary tails, relationships between planets and fixed stars at moments of conjunction. The scribe's hand cramps. He shakes it, resumes. The older astronomer takes his turn at the primary instrument, his movements slower but equally certain. You watch them collaborate without speech, the exchange of roles practiced through years of shared vigil. This rooftop observatory serves temple and royal court simultaneously, producing knowledge that flows downward to priests timing sacrifices, outward to kings' ministers planning campaigns. The network extends beyond this single night, this particular temple, binding together observatories across the Babylonian plain in loose coordination of method, if not always of specific findings. Venus descends toward her setting, her observations complete for this evening. Ishtar's light thickens with atmospheric refraction, reddening slightly, doubling in apparent size as she nears the western horizon. Beluzar permits himself a small sound of satisfaction, perhaps at the quality of data gathered, perhaps at the goddess's graceful departure. The scribe counts his tablets, seals one with a cylinder he wears on a cord around his neck. The seal's impression will identify this record among thousands, should future scholars need to verify or compare. Mars climbs higher, commanding attention now. Nergal's ruddy disk passes through the frame of Beluzar's instrument, and coordinates flow in measured sequence. The cold that arrived with the red planet intensifies, penetrating wool, finding gaps in garment overlap. You pull your own covering closer, grateful for whatever foresight suggested bringing it. The metallic taste of exhaustion has become familiar now, no longer sharp surprise but steady background, like the distant river's voice that rises occasionally when wind shifts from the east. Between Mars measurements, the astronomers eat briefly, dry bread and dates, no feast but sufficient fuel. They offer you none, knowing perhaps that visitors from outside time require no sustenance, or simply absorbed in their proper duties. You do not resent the omission. The particular clarity of desert air continues, stars now countless overhead, the Milky Way a visible river of light competing with the earthly Euphrates below. The roof tiles have finally surrendered their stored warmth, growing cold against your resting palm where you lean. A dog barks somewhere in the city, then stillness returns, broken only by whispered coordinates and the scratch of stylus. The sound recalls other nights, yet here it belongs naturally to the ongoing observation. The astronomers do not look up from their instruments, trusting their ears to register what eyes cannot spare attention for. The bark fades, not echoed, perhaps a stray disturbed by temple cats prowling for rodents among the storerooms. The hour grows late enough that even these dedicated watchers feel time's weight. Beluzar assigns the younger scribe to continue lesser recordings, while the senior men review completed tablets by lamplight. They compare numbers, catch a small error in Venus's third measurement, correct it with fresh scraping and rewriting. Precision matters absolutely. A single wedge misplaced could corrupt prediction, mislead priest or king, dishonor the tradition. That development depended on such relentless attention to detail, generation upon generation, building reliable knowledge from individual nights of scrupulous practice. You stand, stretch carefully, move to the roof's opposite edge, where the ziggurate's shadow falls darkest. From here, the city spreads in patterns of darkness and occasional lamplight, the river catching reflections from watchfires along its banks. You glimpse how completely their sky monitoring interweaves with every other urban function. The watchfires timed by their data, the festival calendar they maintain, the agricultural rhythms their lunar observations predict. No separation exists between science and service, observation and devotion. Mint returns on the air, someone fresh joining the vigil, perhaps a replacement for the scribe whose hand finally failed him. The new arrival carries a sprig still whole, its fragrance released in crushing between fingers. The smell wakes something in you, sharp, green, cutting through oil and dust and cold. You breathe deliberately, storing the sensation against later forgetting. Such details persist when grand narratives dissolve. The specific herb, the particular quality of darkness, the texture of brick beneath fingertips. Mars continues his slow procession, and measurements continue with him. The older astronomer dozes sitting, wrapped in his cloak like cocooned lava, ready to wake if called. Beluzar works on, indefatigable, or perhaps too conscious of responsibility to permit himself rest. Nurgle's nocturnal dominance may require his personal attention, the chief observer's prestige and burden together. You watch his silhouette against starfield, instrument raised, posture unchanged for what seems hours, a living statue dedicated to patient witnessing. The cold deepens further, approaching the night's nadir, that hollow hour before false dawn when body and spirit both descend toward minimum functioning. Even Beluzar shivers now, visible tremor in his free hand between measurements. Yet he does not abandon his post, does not suggest postponement. Systematic astronomical diaries were kept from approximately the 8th century BCE onward, and this night must take its place in that sequence, complete and regular, regardless of discomfort or fatigue. The discipline impresses itself upon you gradually, not as heroic sacrifice, but as simple professional commitment, the weaver at loom, the potter at wheel, the astronomer at his rooftop station. You find yourself counting stars in some idle region, a game from childhood perhaps, or merely distraction from growing stiffness. The particular clarity of desert air makes such counting briefly plausible before magnitude overwhelms effort. Hundreds visible, thousands implied, millions beyond human perception entirely, and each, in its way, observed by some eye somewhere, sometime, entered into some record, however partial. The universe insists on witness, and these Babylonian nights represent one long answer to that insistence, one civilization's method of saying asterisk we saw, we noted, we preserved. Asterisk the scribe changes again, the mint-chewing youth replaced by someone older, more silent. Fresh tablets emerge, old ones stacked in ordered piles. You imagine this night's contributions eventually feeding into compilations like the Enuma Anu Enlil, raw observation transformed through repetition and pattern into interpretive law. The process takes decades, centuries, requires the very cumulative patience that defines this culture's approach to heavenly phenomena. No single night suffices. No single lifetime completes the work. The current series tracks Mars against the Pleiades, the Hyades, the bright eye of the bull himself. Each measurement fixes the wanderer more certainly in his temporary place, narrowing the range of tomorrow's probable location, building the arithmetic foundation from which prediction emerges. Though the full flowering of mathematical astronomy lies centuries ahead, its roots grip firmly in nights like this, in the stubborn accumulation of accurate positions against reliable reference points. You return to your original station, finding the parapet now thoroughly cold, no remnant of daytime warmth surviving. The astronomers seem not to notice, or have long adjusted to conditions you find increasingly demanding. Their wool cloaks, their bodily adaptation, their psychological commitment to task over comfort, all combine to sustain function where you falter. Perhaps this represents initiation's price, the earned capacity that separates dedicated practitioner from casual visitor. That transmission included not merely technical knowledge, but physical tolerance, the trained ability to persist through discomfort that would send others seeking shelter. False dawn begins somewhere beyond eastern hills, not yet visible, but affecting the sky's character. Subtle shift in darkness quality that experienced eyes detect. Beluzar notes it, speaks a word that sends the newest scribe to prepare final tablets. The night's primary work concludes. Only confirmation measurements remain, verification that Mars has not deviated unexpectedly in these last hours. You trace the zodiac's approximate course now, recognizing where equal division would later impose regularity on naturally irregular stellar distribution. The older astronomer wakes, contributes his last measurements, departs down the stair without farewell, too tired perhaps for ceremony, or simply following custom that values action over words. Beluzar remains, supervising closure, ensuring proper storage of instruments, sealing final tablets with his own cylinder. His administrative responsibilities extend beyond observation to preservation, to the proper channeling of produced knowledge toward its institutional users. The tablets he handles now will travel, copied perhaps, certainly consulted, incorporated into growing archives that support state function and religious observance alike. You linger as the sky pales, unwilling to abandon this vantage where so much has unfolded. The roof tiles begin warming again, imperceptibly, promise of day's return, cycle's continuation. The metallic taste of exhaustion has faded, replaced by something emptier, cleaner, the aftermath of sustained attention released. Venus Ishtar has long set. Mars, Nergal, still visible but fading in growing light. Jupiter, Marduk, emerged at some point unnoticed, steady bright in the southwest where morning will soon overwhelm him. You recite the list silently, grounding the abstract in personal memory. Marduk, Ishtar, Nergal, Ninurta, Nabu. Beluzar finally looks directly at you, first acknowledgement of your presence since arrival. His expression holds no surprise, no question, merely acceptance of witness shared. He speaks, voice rough with disuse through the night. Asterisk tomorrow, the moon approaches the scorpion's sting. You may return. Asterisk not invitation exactly, not command, but simple statement of ongoing possibility, the work continuing, the door remaining open. Babylonian astronomy developed from earlier Mesopotamian traditions of celestial observation, and it continues developing still, each night adding incrementally to what was, each observer becoming link in chain, extending backward to origins unknown and forward to terminations unimagined. You descend the stair as light strengthens, finding the temple courtyard transformed from night's mystery, ordinary now, workers moving, priests beginning morning rituals. The astronomers' work joins this larger rhythm, their night vigil feeding days public functions. You see both aspects now in the priest's gestures, the timing of offerings, the calendar's authority derived from such patient nocturnal labor. The connection runs underground, invisible to most participants, yet foundational as bedrock. At the street's edge you pause, look back at the temple roof now empty, instruments stored, observers departed to food and sleep. The particular clarity of desert air persists a few moments more before day's heat and dust begin their work of obscuration. Stars still fade overhead, last holdouts against bluing sky. You carry with you the mince ghost, the stylus scratches memory, the cold's residue in joints and fingertips. The street beneath your sandals widens as the gradient eases, and the river's voice grows from murmur to presence, a low, continuous note that seems to rise from the earth itself rather than arrive through air. You are walking through the quarter where the grain measures offices stand, shuttered now, their clay tablets sealed until morning, their courtyards empty of the scribes who spent the day recording tribute from the northern estates. Around you, the walls of baked brick glow with the particular warmth of sunset, that brief interval when stone holds light longer than sky, when every surface seems to breathe back what it received during hours of merciless sun. The Euphrates, which provided Babylon's essential water supply, transportation corridor, and agricultural irrigation, lies just ahead, its name spoken so often in this city that it requires no introduction, no announcement beyond the deepening sound of water against hulls and the smell of wet rope. The heat breaks as you reach the final slope, a physical sensation like a hand lifting from your shoulder, and shadows lengthen across the packed earth landing where the daily commerce has begun to slow. You are standing at the harbor at dusk, and the merchants are unloading their last cargoes of the day, their movements unhurried now, almost ceremonial, as if the lowering light has dissolved the urgency that possessed them at noon. The thickening coolness rises from the river as the land releases the day's accumulated fire, a current of air that moves against your face with the weight of water within it, carrying mineral salts and the faint sweetness of decayed vegetation from upstream marshes. Above the landing, the first charcoal fires are being lit for the evening meal, and their smoke mingles with river damp and dust settling after the day's traffic, producing that compound odor which belongs to this hour alone, neither day nor night, neither labor nor rest. A barge is poling upstream against the current, and you watch it from the bank where the mud has been worn smooth by generations of feet. The sailors chant in rhythm, their voices low and repetitive, matching the thrust of their poles against the riverbed, and the sound carries across the water with a clarity that the day's heat would have swallowed. The Euphrates' summer low and spring flood dictated the agricultural calendar, and these men know its moods as farmers know the turning stars, their bodies moving in patterns established by fathers and grandfathers who worked this same stretch of water. The barge carries grain from the northern estates, barley and wheat from regions where rainfall supplements the river's gift, and dates from the south, stacked in woven baskets that smell of caramelizing sugar and palm fiber. You can see the cargo clearly because the last light still holds, though it is fading, always fading, the blue of the sky deepening toward a color that has no name in any language you know. The surface of the water holds the last sky color, rippled by a single fish rising, and for a moment the whole river seems to pause in its perpetual motion, arrested by the perfection of that small disturbance. Then the fish is gone, and the rings expand and dissolve into the general brown flow, and the sailors' chant continues, and you become aware that children are splashing somewhere nearby. their voices high and intermittent above the deeper tones of water and men's labor. You walk toward them along the bank where the reeds grow thick, their dry stalks rattling with a sound like distant applause, and the frogs are beginning their chorus in reed beds downstream, a percussion that will build through the evening until it becomes the river's night voice, replacing the human sounds of commerce and passage. Women are filling jars at the water's edge, their movements practiced and economical, and you sit where the mud gives way to a shelf of harder clay, removing your sandals to bathe your feet in the cool, brown water. The temperature shocks slightly, then resolves into pleasure, and you feel the current moving against your ankles, carrying the day's heat away from your body into the greater body of the river. The Euphrates supported fishing, reed cutting, and ferry operations, and you can see evidence of all three in this single prospect. Nets hung to dry on frames of peeled willow, bundles of cut reed stacked for tomorrow's work on the temple barges, and the ferryman securing his vessel for the night, his passengers long since crossed, his fee counted and stored in the leather pouch at his belt. Around you, a few merchants continue unloading, but fewer now, the last determined traders, the ones who could not complete their business in the day's proper hours. The call to evening prayer drifts across the water from a temple tower, and you lift your head from the contemplation of your own feet pale beneath the surface, the toes slightly distorted by refraction. The voice is male, trained, carrying the particular ornamentation that marks temple ritual from household devotion, and it rises and falls in patterns established centuries before your birth, before the city's present walls were raised, perhaps before the city had walls at all. The Euphrates connected Babylon to the Persian Gulf, and thus to maritime trade with Arabia and India, and this prayer, too, traveled routes of water and wind, bearing concepts of divinity that merged and separated, and merged again along the shores of greater seas than this. You do not understand the words, or understand only fragments, enough to recognize the name of the city's patron deity, enough to feel the shape of supplication without grasping its specific object. The sky above the eastern bank has darkened to a blue that borders on purple, and you realize that the last light has moved, concentrated itself, drawn toward the western horizon, where the Ishtar gate stands visible even at this distance, its towers catching what remains of day. You watch the transformation as you might watch a person falling asleep, the same gradual withdrawal of presence, the same softening of edges and intentions. The gate's glazed bricks, those famous blues and whites and golds that travelers describe in letters home, lose their artificial brilliance and become simply surfaces, simply geometry, simply the idea of entrance made material and then dematerialized by the coming night. Barges carried grain, dates, wool, and finished goods between cities, and one such vessel passes now, downstream, riding the current with poles shipped and sails furled, its progress silent except for the creak of timber and the low conversation of crewmen who have worked through the day and look forward to the night's mooring. Bitumen from natural seeps along the river was exported for waterproofing and shipbuilding, and you can smell it now, that petroleum sharpness underlying the organic richness of water and reed and mud, the substance that keeps these vessels afloat and intact, that seals the baskets and jars, that burns in lamps whose light you will soon see pricking the darkness across the river. River traffic included private boats, official vessels, and rafts of inflated skins, and all three types are represented in the scene before you. A fisherman's coracle beached and upturned for repair, a larger craft with painted eyes on its prow that marks it as belonging to some administrative office, and the characteristic skin raft of the downstream nomads, its circular form absurd and practical, capable of carrying remarkable loads on remarkably little draft. The city's location required active management of canals and sluices to prevent flooding, and you observe the evidence of this engineering in the controlled channels that feed the harbor, the regulated flow that keeps the landing accessible even at lowest water, the subtle grading of banks that allows drainage without erosion. These works were built by hands like yours, by minds that understood the river's generosity as inseparable from its danger, the gift and the threat flowing in the same brown water. Evening was the customary time for social gathering, bathing, and lighter labor, and around you the custom asserts itself in the growing number of figures on the bank, the conversations that rise and fall with the ease of people who have survived another day of heat and demand nothing more from the hours ahead than companionship and rest. You withdraw your feet from the water and let them dry in the cooling air, feeling the transition from wet to dry as a small mortality, a rehearsal of larger losses that the evening's mood makes bearable, even pleasant. Temple and palace maintained fleets of boats for ceremonial and practical purposes, and you remember the processions you have seen, the divine images carried downstream to the New Year festival, the royal barge with its gilded fittings and its crew in livery of scarlet and white, the trumpets that preceded it and the silence that followed, as if the river itself paused to acknowledge the passage of power. The stars are becoming visible in the eastern sky, and you recognize the pattern that the astronomers will be climbing to their rooftops to observe, the same stars continuing their ancient journeys, waiting, indifferent, beautiful, observed. The river's course has shifted substantially since antiquity, leaving Babylon's ruins landlocked. But this knowledge belongs to a future you cannot access, a perspective unavailable to any watcher on this bank, and you let it go as you let go of the day's heat, dissolving into the general coolness that rises from the water. Smell of charcoal fires being lit returns you to the immediate, the particular, the landing where cooking has begun in earnest, and the odors of oil and grain and spiced meat overlay the river's own complex perfume. You are hungry, but the hunger is distant, manageable, part of the evening's texture rather than an urgent demand, and you remain seated on the clay shelf as the darkness completes its conquest of the eastern bank and begins to consolidate its hold on the west. Modern dam construction has further altered the Euphrates flow regime, but again this is knowledge from a time beyond your reaching, a modification of the river's behavior that would seem to these sailors and farmers as strange as a change in the moon's phases, as unsettling as a new star in the familiar constellations. The frogs in the reed beds downstream have achieved their full volume now, a continuous throbbing that seems to come from the earth itself rather than any individual creature, and you locate yourself within this sound as you locate yourself within the river's broader voice, a temporary node in networks of exchange and transformation that extend far beyond any individual life. You are standing at the harbor at dusk, though now it is closer to true night, the distinction blurring as the last color drains from the western sky and the Ishtar gate becomes a silhouette, then less than a silhouette, a memory of architecture against a darkness that has absorbed all its particular information. Around you, the merchants have finished unloading their cargoes. The women have filled their jars and departed. The children have been called indoors by voices that carry the particular note of maternal patience worn thin by repetition. The surface of the water holds no sky color now, only the reflection of occasional lamps, fragments of light that shiver and reform with each passing vessel or rising fish. You remain, though the reasons for remaining have become as obscure as the river's source, as the ultimate destination of its waters. Historically, the Euphrates' summer low and spring flood dictated the agricultural calendar, and for millennia farmers marked these cycles, noting the water's height and calculating intervals until planting or harvest, embedding their lives in patterns that the river established and could alter without consultation or warning. You are not such a farmer, not such a calculator, but you participate in the same dependencies, the same faith in continuity that permits the planting of seed, the raising of walls, the counting of years. A single fish rises, close enough that you hear the small disturbance of surface tension, the brief gulp of air, and then the return to element, and you realize that this is the same fish or another fish, the same motion or a different motion, and that the distinction does not matter, has never mattered, is a category error imposed by a mind that insists on particularity where pattern suffices. You are standing at the harbor, and the harbor is changing, becoming night harbor, becoming the place where the ferries rest, and the fishermen mend nets by lamplight, and the city's other life. Its nocturnal commerce of whisper and assignation begins to assert its claims. The call to evening prayer has ceased, replaced by the smaller sounds of domestic ritual, the clatter of ceramic on ceramic, the murmur of families assembled, the occasional cry of an infant negotiating the transition from waking to sleep. You think of your own roof, your own lamp, the letter you began this morning and did not finish, the friend in a distant city who waits for news of Babylon, of the river, of the life that flows here as water flows, as time flows, as all things flow according to patterns that observation reveals but does not explain. The frogs continue their chorus in reed beds downstream, and you find that you have been listening to them without attending, that the sound has become part of your own internal landscape, indistinguishable from heartbeat or breathing, a rhythm that sustains rather than interrupts. You stand, finally, your feet dry now, cooled by evaporation and by the air's gradual descent toward the temperature of water, and you begin to walk along the bank, away from the landing, toward the quieter reaches where the reeds grow thickest, and the city's presence diminishes to a glow on the horizon, a rumor of population rather than its immediate pressure. Dates were likely a principal crop of southern Mesopotamia, with barley and wheat more common in the north, and one can imagine passing storage facilities where harvested crops awaited distribution. Massive structures designed to keep contents cool through thick walls and narrow ventilation. The agricultural wealth that the river made possible and the city consumed. The last light has gone from the Ishtar Gate's towers, which exist now only as absence, as the space where something was and may be again at dawn, when the cycle of illumination recommences. You have watched this transition before, will watch it again if the days granted you extend so far, and each watching is similar, and each is unique, as each day is similar and unique, as each breath repeats and varies the fundamental pattern of inhalation and release. You see none of the river's traffic now, only the dark shapes of moored craft, their identities obscured by night, their purposes suspended until morning restores the distinctions that darkness dissolves. You are walking beside the Euphrates, and the river's sound accompanies your steps, that low continuous note that greeted your arrival now bidding farewell to your departure, unchanged by your presence, unaffected by your watching, yet somehow, in ways that resist analysis, constituted in part by your attention, requiring a witness as all processes require witnesses, as meaning requires minds that mean, as the stars require astronomers to complete their beauty through recognition. You cross one of the sluices now, a narrow bridge of planks where the regulated water drops to a lower level, singing in the small turbulence of its descent, carrying oxygen to fish and nutrients to fields that lie invisible in the surrounding darkness. The sound changes as you cross, becomes multiple, becomes a conversation between levels and pressures, and then resolves again into the single voice as you reach the farther bank, and the canal joins the main stream, loses its temporary identity in the greater flow. Behind you, on the streets that lead upward from the river, you hear the sounds of evening gathering, the particular density of human presence that the cooler hours permit. the city's deferred sociability released now from the constraints of heat and productive necessity. You imagine the temple and palace fleets at rest, moored in their assigned places, their painted eyes staring blindly into darkness, their crews dispersed to homes and hearths and the simpler boats of family life. You have seen such vessels in daylight, have admired their craftsmanship, the integration of function and display that marks the city's highest achievements, and you know that they will sail again, will carry their images and their dignitaries along the routes that the river establishes, maintaining the visible connections between divine and human, between center and periphery, between the Babylon that is and the Babylon that is imagined in distant courts and temples, where the name alone conjures wealth and power and the mysterious authority of age. You continue walking, though the path grows less certain, though the reeds crowd closer, and the ground underfoot becomes less reliable, more inclined to softness, to the surrender of weight into mud. The frogs are louder here, or you are closer to their centers of congregation, and the sound envelops you, becomes indistinguishable from your own pulse, from the blood's percussion in ears that have adjusted to darkness, that find in this reduced input a compensation of heightened sensitivity, a world enlarged by subtraction. Such projects belong to a different imagination than yours, a different relation to time and water, and the necessary accommodations that living here, beside this river, in this city, has always demanded. You prefer the older way, the watching and waiting, the acceptance of flood and drought, as phases of a cycle that exceeds individual preference, that requires the humility of adaptation rather than the pride of mastery. You stop, finally, at a place where the bank curves inward, forming a small cove where the current slows and the mud accumulates, where the reeds grow so thick that passage becomes impossible, and you must either retrace your steps or accept this as your destination, your terminus for this evening's wandering. You accept. You are standing at the river's edge in full darkness now, and the city behind you has become a texture of light and sound rather than a visible presence, a concentration of human effort that extends backward through time as the river extends forward through space, both reaching toward origins and ends that remain unknown, that perhaps must remain unknown for the middle passage to sustain its interest, its capacity for surprise and renewal. A single fish rises, close enough that you hear it, and then another, farther out, establishing a pattern that may continue or may cease, that requires your continued attention to confirm or deny. You attend. You attend to the frogs as well, distributing your consciousness across these simultaneous presences, refusing the hierarchy that would privilege one sense, one stimulus, one aspect of the world's offering over others equally available, equally deserving of the gift of notice. Smell of charcoal fires being lit reaches you even here, distant and refined by passage through intervening space, a reminder of the city's persistence, its refusal to dissolve entirely into the night that surrounds and penetrates it. You are part of that persistence, contribute to it by your presence, your watching, your willingness to remain awake when sleep would be easier, when the horizontal position and the closed eye would release you from the obligation of witness. But you remain standing, remain attending, and the river continues its flow, and the stars continue their ancient journeys, waiting, indifferent, beautiful, observed, and the night deepens around you like water around a wading man, gradually, completely, without the violence of sudden submersion, but with the inevitability that all gradual processes achieve in their completion. The Euphrates flows past your station, carrying its freight of silt and history and the dissolved substances of 1,000 upstream lives, 1,000 upstream deaths, the continuous recycling that makes water ancient and makes it perpetually new. Around you, the merchants have long since finished unloading their cargoes. The sailors have secured their vessels. The ferryman has counted his fee and sleeps now in whatever shelter the night offers, dreaming perhaps of crossings, of the balanced load, of the safe arrival that defines his professional existence. The agricultural calendar that these crops establish continues its rotation, the days shortening now toward the period of sowing, the interval of growth, the eventual harvest that will repeat what has been repeated for centuries, for millennia, for as long as the river has made such repetition possible. You will not see this harvest, or may not see it, but the possibility of your seeing participates in the general possibility that sustains the planting, that makes reasonable the labor of preparation and waiting. The farmers who calculate by the river's events sleep now, or prepare for sleep, their bodies aligned with the rhythms that their work requires, the early rising, the midday rest, the evening return. Somewhere a barge moves even now, navigating by stars or by the familiar shapes of bankside landmarks, its crew working in shifts through the night to maintain progress against the current or to maximize the advantage of downstream flow.